Welcome to the SAFMR virtual convening. Before we begin, please take a moment to review the directions on the screen. During the presentation, if you have any technical issues, please use the chat panel. If you have content-related questions, please use the Q&A panel. Be sure to direct your questions to all panelists. Today's presentation will feature two Q&A sessions, where participants can type or verbally ask their questions, but you can enter your questions into the Q&A panel at any time. Please note that we may not be able to address all questions today, but we will gather and address each question in an FAQ document. The FAQ document, as well as the recorded presentation, will be available on HUD Exchange in a few weeks. Please also note that the PowerPoint presentation will also be posted to HUD Exchange. The recording, slides, and any mentioned resources will be posted on the class page where you launched this webinar. Today's convening will review small area fair market rents, and we plan to meet for a few hours to discuss this and address your questions. The presentation was prepared by CVR Associates, Inc. Michael Tonovitz, who is a member of the CVR team, will be kicking off the webinar. Michael?
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Michael Tonovitz, and I'm Vice President for CVR Associates. I will be facilitating today, but I'd like to start by introducing Richard Minacchio, who is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Public and Indian Housing, for some opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thanks to CVR and to my team for putting this together. And really, thank you all for joining us. This is we have a really robust attendance here, and I couldn't be more pleased that so many of you are joining us. You know, there's a lot on the plates of housing authorities now and HUD. We know that this program and policy is particularly important to me. The expansion of the small area fair market rents. When I was a housing authority director, before I came here 8 months ago, this program was critical to the voucher program, because we had an area like many of yours where the standard fair market rents shut a lot of people out of a lot of communities, zip codes, suburbs, etc. So, you know, when you're talking about access, fair housing, and choice, you really are talking about the small area fair market rent program. We just expanded it. There's 41 new metropolitan areas that are going to be involved, several hundred PHAs as well. It's going to mean that almost half of the vouchers in the entire country will fall under the small area fair market rents, which means that there's real choice in the program. The way the program works, in the way in which you'll hear today, and which you probably already know, the rents are set by zip code as opposed to metropolitan area, and there's ways to do this, and you'll hear today from our panelists. There's ways to group zip codes and things like that to make it easier to administer. But you know, the reason this is being done is because, you know, over the last 10 years or so, there's just been a wealth of empirical evidence that shows that households, especially with younger children, that avail themselves of certain neighborhoods, the kids tend to do much better. They do much better in school. They do much better in future education, and they do much better in employment. So the goal here is to make sure that people just have the chance, right? It's not a mandate. It's a mandate in the sense that PHAs have to offer it, but it's certainly not a mandate when we talk about a participant, right? Because we know that many participants like where they live, may move into another area that is similar in rent, and that's okay. But it's very difficult to call this the housing choice voucher program when the program itself, without this feature, really restricts choice. The housing authority, I came from the Cook County Housing Authority. We actually were one of the first 3 in the country to volunteer to do this, because I come from an area like many of you that, if you look at a heat map of where your voucher holders live, you have a lot of big dots in certain parts of your city or county, and then either no dots or very small dots in other parts of the city or county. So, it's just not right. And I also want to thank our Office of Policy Development and Research that worked very closely with PIH on this over the years to develop the plan. And I really want to thank the 3 PHAs that have agreed to be here with us today. We're calling this communities of practice. When we were thinking about and then finally implementing this rule that added PHAs and metro areas to the program, I was pretty adamant that the best way for PHAs to learn how to do this, to develop a program and then manage it most efficiently, is by those PHAs who have succeeded. So I really want to offer my thanks to our friends from Allegheny County, Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, Plano, Texas, and Boston, who are with us today, and with the HUD staff and CVR are going to give you a really good idea about how to develop this program. The one thing I want folks to know, though, is, we have a long lead-in time here. We know it's a lot, but we don't want people to feel pressure. We want people to feel like there's a community out there that's going to assist in making sure that you're able to develop a program that works for you, and along the way, help you work out the kinks. So with that, I will turn it back to Michael, but I do want to, we want your feedback, and I do really want to thank you, because this is one of the most significant things that HUD has done, I think, since its inception, making sure that our families have access to neighborhoods of their choice. And that's what this program is. So thank you again for joining us, and I look forward to sticking around for as much as I can. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Richard. So I want to introduce myself again. I'm Michael Tunovitz from CVR Associates, and we are a HUD technical assistance provider. And I personally have more than 30 years experience, and I primarily work with the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And CVR was instrumental in helping several housing authorities implement the last round of mandatory small area FMRs. For today's agenda, we're going to start out with policy research, the PD&R, so Policy Development and Research Group, that's going to talk about why small area FMRs and why they're important, all of the research and policy behind the decisions. And then I'm going to spend some time getting into the nuts and bolts of what are the policy requirements to implement mandatory small area FMRs. I'll talk about some of the resources that are available to help you and the technical assistance that HUD's going to make available. We're going to take a break about halfway through, and we are going to open it up to best practices by the 3 housing authority guests, and then we will wrap up. So some real basic overviews before we hear from our friends at HUD. So smaller FMRs, they're fair market rents that are at a zip code level. They only apply to the voucher program. There are other housing programs that use the fair market rents, and there will be no change to those non-voucher programs. already determines small area FMRs in every metropolitan community. This information is already available, and I'm actually going to show you an example of it later today. And a designated small area FMR housing authority is a housing authority that is required to use the small area FMRs to set payment standards in its voucher program. And as Mr. Minacchio said, the small area FMRs have been shown to be a very important tool in promoting housing choice and expanding access to rental units, particularly in low poverty areas, and they have been shown to be an important tool in increasing utilization. So in the original rollout in 2018, there were 192 housing authorities in 24 metropolitan areas that were required to make the change to small area FMRs. Since then, another 70 have taken advantage of the option to use small area FMRs to set some exception payment standards in low poverty areas. 12 more have opted in completely. And the new rollout includes another 263 housing authorities in 41 metropolitan areas. Just to give you a little idea of what it looks like, the blue on this map were the original 24 metropolitan areas, and then the orange are where all of the new SAFMR mandatory areas will be effective with the new rollout later this year. And with that said, I'm going to turn things briefly over to Danielle Bastarash from HUD.
All right. Thank you very much, Michael. And hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. Thanks to CVR and the HUD team for pulling the convening together. And a special shout out to all of the PHAs here. We know that SAFMRs will affect you all in different ways, depending on the location and the rental markets in which you operate. And unlike the first time around when we did this, and the information, guidance, expertise was all really driven by headquarters, this time we're working extensively with our field offices. We have a lot of technical assistance and a lot of voucher program experts dedicated to this effort. And also, as Rich mentioned, we have with us those PHAs that have been through it. And so we have lessons learned from the first timers that can be shared with you both today and moving forward. So today it is my pleasure to be able to introduce my colleague, Peter Kahn. Pete currently serves as the Associate Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Policy Development in HUD's Office of Policy Development and Research, which is known as PD&R. He is one of the key experts who has helped develop SAFMRs since the beginning. And he's going to share some background on why HUD moved towards SAFMRs and fair market rents, and what we know about how well they're working for families, landlords, and PHAs. Prior to his current role, he was the Director of Program Parameters and Research, where his office, economists and social scientists, would look at various program operating requirements, including fair market rents, median family incomes, income limits, and inflation factors. So Pete isn't just the SAFMR guy, he also was the FMR guy, the inflation factor guy, and the income guy. So thank you, Pete, for joining us today. We're looking forward to hearing more about the why behind SAFMRs. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Danielle. I appreciate that introduction. I like to say that that I'm the guy that takes the bullets, or I used to be the guy that takes the bullets for the agency when it comes to all things FMRs. I have moved on from that particular role, but it's interesting to now be on the policy side of the house as we expand the use of small area FMRs. And while, I technically work in the Office of Policy Development and Research, I really do feel like I'm part of the PIH family, particularly when it comes to the topic of small area FMRs. The question of quote unquote, why small area FMRs is a very robust question. And I want to start off by providing just a little bit of a roadmap of where we're going to go with my time with you today. So what we're going to talk about is, sort of what problems do small area FMRs solve? Part of that discussion, we'll talk a little bit about what are FMRs and how are they calculated. And then we'll also talk about how small area FMRs work to solve the problems. I'm going to also address the question of why was your area selected and why now? That will touch a little bit on the rulemaking from 2016. We're also going to talk a little bit about, do small area FMRs work? This is going to talk a little bit about the history of where small area FMRs came from, along with a discussion of some of the research from back during the rulemaking time and some current research that is being done today. We will have one of our Q&A periods at the end of my remarks. So without any further ado, what problems do small area FMRs solve? Metropolitan FMRs is a single FMR value calculated over one or multiple counties for an entire metropolitan area. And so even with payment standard flexibility, within that basic range of 90 to 110%, there are likely going to be areas within that metropolitan area that voucher holders just can't access. And so that's certainly one of the problems that we were trying to solve with small area FMRs. So as Rich said, small area FMRs are fair market rents calculated for zip codes within metropolitan areas. And what that really helps to do is to help localize rents within metropolitan areas. We hope that it will allow us to provide higher levels of subsidy through payment standards that allow voucher holders the opportunity to access those high opportunity areas, while also lowering rents in areas that have lower opportunities within the metropolitan area. So the next two slides really talk about or are sort of visual depictions of four of the new metropolitan areas that we have. And I really want these to be illustrative of the types of change we're talking about here. So on the left-hand side of the screen, this is a depiction of the Orlando, Florida metropolitan area. From that very tippy top point to the bottom, that's 113 miles top to bottom. It's 61 miles across at the middle. It encompasses 3 counties, Lake Orange and Osceola counties. There are approximately 400,000 renter-occupied units in the metro area. And so think about that, having one FMR, and under small area FMRs, there are 153 zip codes in that MSA. On the right is the Dayton-Kettering MSA, not quite as large as Orlando, but again, 38 miles from top to bottom, 48 miles across at its widest. Again, another 3-county area, 121,000 renter-occupied units in the metro area. One FMR becomes 89 zip codes and therefore 89 FMRs. 2 more examples, just to sort of, depending on where you are located in the country. Panel on the left is the Cleveland, Ohio area. Again, 64 miles from top to bottom, 68 miles across. This is a 5-county metro area with approximately 300,000 renter units. Again, 1 metro FMR to 126 zip codes. And then finally on the right, the Raleigh, North Carolina MSA, which is 66 miles top to bottom, 48 miles across. Again, 3 counties, 180,000 renter units. 1 metro FMR becomes 86 zip codes. So again, part of the why small area FMRs is to allow us the opportunity to better fine tune our fair market rents to local market conditions, and with payment standard flexibility on top of that, to really drive home the ability for our voucher families to use their voucher in areas of higher opportunity. So I come from PD&R, policy development and research, and one of the things that we do look at is research into the voucher program. I think it's important to understand where the voucher program is, and so a Center on Budget and Policy Priorities report that was done in conjunction with the Poverty and Race Research Action Council share the following statistics. About 1 in 7 families with children living in metro areas live in neighborhoods with poverty rates less than 10%. We would consider those to be the higher opportunity areas. That 1 in 7, which is about 14%, compares to about 25% of voucher affordable units also being located into those low poverty neighborhoods. So, voucher families in general aren't getting there in the proportion that the units themselves are located. And then from PD&R's own picture of subsidized households, which we have available at huduser.gov, that shows that the average poverty rate for voucher families for where they are for the location of their housing unit is about 18%. And again, we're trying to ensure that our voucher families are able or to have access to those units in the higher opportunity areas. So this slide talks about what are FMRs. And I want to make sure we are all on the same page. We're all using the same terminology. And so I'm going to just talk a little bit about what goes into the FMR and then in subsequent slides, how they are calculated. The FMR is a measure of rent that takes into account the cost of the shelter plus the cost of necessary utilities. Now, the utilities are all the major utilities except for telephone, cable, or satellite television and internet access and internet services. These come from the statutory requirements of the voucher program. And I do know that there has been a little bit of concern about specifically the last in terms of internet services, but at the moment we are not covering that in what the FMR is scheduled to cover. So when you look at materials from PD&R, you will likely see that PD&R calls the FMR gross rent. And I've been warned that gross rent might have different meanings to different people. So again, when PD&R says gross rent, we mean the cost of the shelter plus the cost of necessary utilities. Some other terms that you might hear is contract rent. And when PD&R thinks about contract rent, that is the monthly rent that is specified in the lease. It may just be the cost of the shelter if no utilities are included, or it could be all the way to gross rent if all utilities are included, or contract rent could fall somewhere in between, depending on what utilities are included in the unit as part of the lease. FMRs are calculated for metropolitan areas and non-metropolitan counties. HUD has a little bit of discretion in how we define metropolitan areas. Generally speaking, a metropolitan area is defined by the Office of Management and Budget. But when those definitions change, particularly as a county may be added to a metropolitan area, HUD has some discretion to calculate a separate FMR for that added county, again, trying to keep rents as localized as possible. We also calculate fair market rents for non-metropolitan counties. Now, at the moment, in terms of small area FMRs are only calculated for metropolitan areas. And that's generally based on the availability of data. By law, FMRs must be made effective on October 1st of each year, but the law also requires HUD to make those FMRs available 30 days prior to them becoming effective. So we typically release new FMRs on or about September 1 of each year with a public comment period. The next two slides contain a lot of words and a lot of technical jargon, and I'm not really going to cover these word for word. I have them included in the presentation for completeness, but I really want to talk about what the essence of the FMR is and how we get there. So one of the things that I think is very important to understand about the FMR is that the FMR is calculated as a 40th percentile measure of rent. And for those whom the statistics classes are ways in the rearview mirror, basically what 40th percentile means is that 40% of the rental units in the area over which FMRs are calculated will have gross rents at or below the level of the FMR. But that also means that 60% of the rental units over that area of geography will also have rents above the FMR. Our primary source of data for the FMR is the American Community Survey. The ACS is a product of the Census Bureau and provides updated information on rents and other socioeconomic factors every year. The first bullet here says that when calculating the FMR, we take into account certain amenities in the unit. That's what the standard quality means. So for example, we ensure that the survey responses that go into providing our numbers for FMRs are units that have complete kitchen facilities, complete bathroom facilities, are on less than 10 acres to ensure there are no farm subsidies impacting the rent. And so that is the sort of the base level information that goes into the calculation. But we also want to make sure that the reported rent for the unit is from someone who has recently moved into the unit, so that we are getting, the closest survey response to the market rent for that value. Below that, we're talking about how we would calculate a recent mover adjustment in areas where there is insufficient data to actually get a survey-based recent mover rent directly. Again, we're dealing with a massive amount of data for every metro area, every zip code in those metro areas, and the non-metro counties. And so once we have a measure of gross rent for recent movers for the area that we are calculating the FMR, we need to account for rent inflation between the time of the survey and what we know has happened since the survey was undertaken. So let's use the fiscal year 24 fair market rents as an example. The fiscal year 24 FMRs find their basis in data collected from this through the ACS through 2021. To bridge the gap between 2021 and 2022, HUD uses a combination of consumer price index measured growth in rents, as well as private market rent data measuring rent growth between 21 and 22 to inflate that ACS data to be as of 2022. However, in the summer of 2023, when HUD is calculating those 2024 fair market rents, we have little information about rent growth beyond 2022. Therefore, HUD forecasts the expected growth in gross rents for CPI, metropolitan areas, and the 4 census regions, and applies that local forecast to each area to arrive at the 2024 fair market rents. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into how we calculate the FMRs. So now that we all have a common understanding of what problem small area FMRs are trying to solve and a basic understanding of how FMRs are calculated, you may be wondering, why was my area selected and why was it selected now? So for the why my area was selected, we have to go back to the 2016 rule that we created. There were 5 criteria that HUD uses to evaluate metropolitan areas for small area FMR use. So the first one is just a simple number of vouchers under the lease. And that the critical value there is at least 2,500 vouchers under lease within the metropolitan area. We wanted to make sure that the area was sufficiently large to warrant conversion. Next, we have 2 different measures of voucher concentration. And the first measure I'll say is what we'll call an absolute measure of voucher concentration. So our voucher holders, and 25% or more of the voucher holders in a metropolitan area, living in what we would call a concentrated low-income area. A concentrated low-income area under this rule is any census tract with a poverty rate of more than 25%, or census tracts where more than 50% of the households in the tract earn less than 60% of the area's median income and are designated as qualified census tracts. So basically, what we're looking at are those sort of lower opportunity tracts, and that's what we're calling a concentrated low income area. So if 25% or more of the vouchers within that metro area are living in those concentrated low income areas, that would meet the criteria for small area FMR conversion. So the second measure of concentration is relative, right? So we're looking at where voucher holders are living. And if a voucher holder or a voucher family is living in a concentrated low income area, and they are significantly more likely to live in a concentrated low income area than sort of where the distribution of rental units are, that also would fulfill the criteria. So in this particular case, or in the case of the rule, voucher holders have to be 55% more likely to live in a concentrated low income area than where renter units are located in general across the metro area. The fourth criteria is another location based criteria, but this looks at the location of renter units. So we're looking at those metro areas where at least 20% of the renter units within the metropolitan area are located in zip codes with small area FMRs greater than 110% of the metro area FMR. So if you think about that, basically what we're saying is at least 20% of the renter units in this metro area couldn't be reached by a voucher holder with a metro FMR at a 110% payment standard. So really these units are out of reach for the voucher holders. And finally, the last criteria looks at the vacancy rate of the area. The vacancy rate has to be at least 4% in the metropolitan area. And this criteria allows there to be sufficient units available in the market for voucher holders to be able to compete for units in the higher opportunity areas. So turning to the why now question, the 2016 rule requires HUD to evaluate new data every 5 years. I think 2016 plus 5, that's 2021. We're a little late. If you think back to the implementation of small area FMRs, at least the first mandatory cohort, those PHAs actually started using small area FMRs in 2018. 2018 plus 5 is 2023, hence the expansion of the program in 2023. So a little bit more on this topic of the, sort of why was my area selected and why now, and really the why small area FMRs question as well. Prior to the implementation of small area FMRs, the primary tool that HUD had for addressing high concentration of voucher holders in metropolitan areas was what we knew as the 50th percentile rule. So instead of FMRs being set at the 40th percentile, FMRs would be set at the 50th percentile. But under that particular rule, areas would be re-evaluated for their 50th percentile status every 3 years. And areas could actually switch from 50th percentile back to 40th percentile if measurable deconcentration wasn't achieved. So due to this experience, as part of the 2016 rule, HUD included that once an area was designated as a small area FMR, the designation was permanent. So once in, HUD doesn't reevaluate areas. So only new areas may be selected every 5 years. So a little bit of history around small area FMRs. So I know that we had shared that we would talk about do small area FMRs work. Well, one of the things to point out is that early in the first Obama administration, then HUD Secretary Sean Donovan challenged PD&R to find a way to calculate FMRs for smaller units of geography. I will spare you all of the gory details of how we got there, but the department landed on zip codes because of their size, their ease to understand, and the fact that we would get updated information annually on zip codes through the American Community Survey. Now, while we were working on the development of small area FMRs, HUD was sued by a fair housing organization operating in the Dallas, Texas metro area. As part of the settlement negotiations of that lawsuit, HUD offered to make the Dallas, Texas area one of the first areas to be included in our small area FMR demonstration. And PHAs in the Dallas metro area began using small area FMRs in 2011. It took us a little while to get the rest of the demonstration participants up and running, but beginning in 2012, 5 additional PHAs, the town of Mamaroneck, Chattanooga, Cook County, thank you, Rich, Laredo, Texas, and Long Beach, California, all began using small area FMRs for a period of 4 years. So in addition to us running this demonstration, there was some external research in the academic community that began to appear, and there were promising results starting to manifest in Dallas due to the small area FMR implementation, at least compared to Dallas using 50th percentile FMRs. PD&R also conducted an evaluation of our demonstration program, and I want to share some selected findings from that demonstration. Small area FMRs increased the pool of rental units potentially available to voucher families in high opportunity neighborhoods and decreased the pool in low opportunity neighborhoods. Voucher families in small area FMR PHAs were more likely to live in higher rent and higher opportunity zip codes than they had prior to the demonstrations. Households in comparison PHAs saw no changes. Consequently, the conclusion was that this shift was based and attributable to the implementation of small area FMRs. And also hearkening back to Rich's opening comments, new voucher families and existing families who moved to new units after the implementation or after the introduction of small area FMRs showed that a higher percentage of those families moved to higher rent and higher opportunity zip codes than did the families in comparison PHAs. This effect was particularly strong for households with children. And finally, most of the PHAs that were part of the evaluation of the demonstration concluded that the administrative costs and burden of implementing and administering small area FMRs were justified by what they saw as the benefits to their voucher families having access to higher opportunity neighborhoods. So the impact of small area FMRs, and this really gets to the question of, do small area FMRs work? So for this round of the expansion, PD&R and PIH undertook a robust outreach approach beyond just doing that data evaluation. We spoke with PHAs in 4 of the original areas required to implement small area FMRs. We also spoke to 2 external research groups who are using HUD administrative data to look at small area FMR impacts. And so what the research shows is that the small area FMRs brought about modest but statistically significant reductions in the average poverty rate of neighborhoods where new admits in the voucher program were moving. The program reduced their overall exposure to high poverty neighborhoods, and this finding held across demographic groups, including households of color and those with children. After implementing small area FMRs, new admissions are moving to neighborhoods with higher rents. The research found no impact on the success rate for voucher households, including for Black and Hispanic voucher households and those with children. And one other thing to note is that PHAs operating in areas where a large share of their units have small area FMRs that are less than metropolitan area wide FMRs showed that there was an increase in voucher holders leasing outside of their service areas. So just some resources, and as these slides are being shared, you can find the FMRs at huduser.gov. We have an online documentation system that provides the step-by-step details of all of the calculations. We have the official versions of the Federal Register notices and the schedules that accompany that. And then we have electronic versions of the FMR data, and typically in Excel or CSV files. And so these other bullets will allow you to get to some additional information about small area FMRs. So I think we're at our first Q&A.
Jesse has the questions and he's going to read them off. And if you can answer them, that's fantastic. If we can't answer, if there are any questions we can't answer at this time or that are going to be covered later, I will say so. But also, even if none of us know the answer to the question, we will get the answer and it will be in the Q&A document that'll get published. So Jesse, what's our first question?
Sure. So we've got a couple of questions that have come in. In reviewing the current SAFMRs for my service area, it appears that tenants may experience some hardship and maybe over the because of the payment standards and may pay more out of pocket. How do I go about not hurting my current tenants with some concern about how to maybe to avoid or reduce this impact? And I'm not sure if those are one of the things that we're going to be discussing later in the presentation, but this is a concern that a few PHAs are voicing in their questions.
If I may, I'm going to ask that we hold that question because we are going to talk about the different options that PHAs have to mitigate those concerns, probably in about half an hour to 40 minutes.
So I'll take the one, there's one question I see in the chat that talks about I think it says would be awesome if HUD would just give us the utility allowances in those calculations. Unfortunately, the ACS data is not sufficiently robust to allow us to break things out by different types of utilities. So when we get the data from the Census Bureau, we get a gross rent number. So it already has the cost of the shelter plus the cost of those utilities already in the number. And that's not something that we can break out in the data that we receive. That's a question that we have explored many times, and the data just aren't robust enough for us to break out the utilities from the gross rent value.
All right, it looks like we have another one that might be good for you, Peter. It says, our PHA's jurisdiction has less than a 4% vacancy rate. It's closer to 1 to 2%. Do we still qualify for SAFMRs?
So yes, so we are measuring vacancy rate over the entire metropolitan area. So if you are looking at a portion of the metro area that has a vacancy rate of less than 4%, then that is not grounds for you to not be considered qualifying for small area FMRs. So it's a little unclear to me if your jurisdiction covers the entire metro area or not. It also may be a function of how vacancy rates are being calculated. We have published our vacancy rate calculation methodology as part of the rule. And so at the time of the assessment, all of the areas in the new 41 had at least a 4% vacancy rate.
And if I may just add something to that, in an earlier slide, I showed how there are 70 housing authorities that have decided to use small area FMRs for exception payment standards. So if a particular housing authority in your jurisdiction, if you are experiencing challenges in your voucher program because the market's tight and there's not a lot of vacancies, smaller FMRs can be a tool that actually helps because it can result in higher payment standards in certain zip codes, which can open up more rental units to be accessible to the voucher program.
Let's
So
see.
I've got one more question about how do you find specific zip codes that HUD has identified as needing small area FMRs. So at huduser.gov, under the data sets page, we have a specific data set page devoted to small area FMRs. And within that page, you can select every or any metropolitan area within the country, and it will show all of the zip codes within that metropolitan area.
And Peter, just to confirm, that in the metropolitan service areas, that zip code level data is available whether or not a housing authority is in a mandatory small area FMR community.
Yeah, that's correct. Well, yes, we publish small area FMRs for every metropolitan area in the country, regardless of whether or not one of the area is a mandatory area. Part of the reason for that is that small area FMRs in non-mandatory areas can be used as the basis for setting exception payment standards, or as supporting information for approval of exception payment standards. So every metropolitan zip code is published both in an online lookup system and in an Excel spreadsheet that relates the zip code to the metro area.
Mike Shore, I see you have your hand raised, so I'm going to go ahead and request that you unmute your microphone. And so if you can accept that request, then you can speak, and it looks like you have. So Mike, you have the floor. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Curious about some of us who operate other HUD-funded rental assistance programs, specifically the Continuum of Care program, tenant-based, permanent supportive housing that acts a lot like a voucher, but is not quite a voucher. We're using fair market rents in those programs for a number of things, and just curious as to the discussion between PIH and CPD on applicability for small area FMRs for those that are operating across divisions. Maybe more succinctly, do we use small area FMRs for purposes of ESG and COC programs funded by HUD? I think it's
So I don't know if we have any ESG or COC experts on the call. I can tell you that as a member of the team that was that was responsible for writing the rule back in 2016, the small area FMR rule only covers the Housing Choice Voucher Program. In terms of mandatory use of small area FMRs, you would actually have to talk to an expert in either the COC or ESG program about what the applicable FMRs are for that program. But the rule itself only covers the voucher program.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to follow that up. Just more of a comment. That's what we hear frequently, right? There's some of these kind of cross-cutting areas between the divisions, and understand that that's the answer at this point. Just want to advocate for the difficulty that will occur in communities where you've got different tenant-based rental assistance programs operating in the same jurisdiction with different models, and would just advocate that CPD and PIH get together quickly and take a look at that. It really puts certain programs at a disadvantage, and it's going to cause confusion with property owners and managers, and that's not something we need to be doing.
Thank you for the feedback.
Okay, well, it looks like we're going to go ahead and move forward to the next stage of the presentation. And so now I'm going to toss it back over to Michael Tonovitz, who will then lead us through the next section of the presentation.
So again, we're going to spend, from now until the break, we're going to talk about all the underlying policies relating to mandatory small area FMRs, the resources that HUD is making available to help you with this transition. And also I'm going to spend a little time just making you aware of some additional technical assistance that HUD will be making available in the very near future. So PIH Notice 2023-32. This is the notice that basically introduced that there are 41 new metropolitan areas that are subject to small area FMRs. So again, in these metropolitan areas, housing authorities will be required to use zip code based fair market rents to set the payment standards rather than relying on a single FMR for the entire program jurisdiction. Why is this happening now? As Peter mentioned, HUD is required to designate new small area FMR areas based on its criteria every 5 years. And once a PHA has been designated as a small area FMR community, it remains that way permanently. PHAs will receive $10,000 of extra administrative fees in order to pay for some of the extraordinary costs you'll have with the conversion. It's really important to note that PIH Notice 2018-01, it prescribes all of the mandatory SAFMR operating requirements, and quite a bit of what I'm going to cover is going to go over those rules as they pertain to the mandatory PHAs. So MTW agencies, there are 19 MTW agencies that are included in the small area FMRs communities. So the MTW office did send a separate letter to each of those PHAs last year. There is a section, it's section 6 of the 2018 notice, that does outline the special rules that apply to MTW agencies. We're not really going to dive into them because MTW agencies are unique, each having their own MTW agreement. But basically, to summarize, if there are any MTW agencies that joined us today, that you are exempt if you have an alternate payment standard policy in place that's already approved in your MTW plan. If you don't have an alternative payment standard process, then you do have to make the conversion. There are two key dates here. You must have adopted your new payment standards using the SAFMRs no later than October 1 of 2024, and then you have another 3 months until January 1 of 2025 to be fully compliant. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. That doesn't mean that everybody's going to convert by January 1 because you're going to go through your normal re-exam process. But this basically means that you may adopt your new payment standards, but you may have already had some re-exams in progress. So you must be fully compliant in all transactions that you process on or after January 1 that would require using the new payment standards that you do so. And again, we're going to talk about in a little while one of the most important issues, which is what happens if payment standards are going down. So there are some suspensions and temporary exemptions that are in the 2018 notice, and a PHA could be the one to initiate it, and there could be an instance where HUD would reach out to the Housing Authority to say that small area FMRs should be suspended. But and even unless you're an MTW agency that can be permanently exempted, any suspension would be temporary. And they typically would have to do if there's a unique situation where there has been a presidentially declared disaster area and that there was a wide-scale loss of housing stock or something else that has caused a sudden market change. It's important to note that just because the small area FMRs are lower than the area-wide FMR for your particular jurisdiction doesn't give you grounds for a temporary suspension. And I have experienced that, where a particular PHA is in mostly serves high poverty census tracts, and for the entire jurisdiction, each of those zip codes has a lower small area FMR than the area-wide FMR. So we did talk about how to locate this, the small area FMRs. And I think this is important. So the 2024 small area FMRs, so those are the ones that are in effect through September 30th of 2024. They are available if you go to huduser.gov and click on the box that says data sets. So then you can click on another box that says fair market rents. And then you will have access to the small area FMRs. You can look them up for any year if you're interested in a history. And you can look them up for any metropolitan service area. So why is this important? Why, even if you're not required to implement until October 1 of this year, why would you want to look them up? Well, let me show you. This is for Buffalo, New York, and the area surrounding it, which is one of the 41 new metropolitan service areas. You should probably be taking a look now so you can see what the impact is going to be by zip code. Yes, these are not the small area FMRs that will be in place come October 1, but it can give you an idea of the variability that you're going to have and what the small area FMRs look like as opposed to the current fair market rent. This is key. This is something you should start doing sooner, not later, starting to get a good understanding of the impact this is going to have throughout your program jurisdiction, because it's going to be very helpful in your setting of payment standards. So again, PIH Notice 2018-01. It has all of the mandatory requirements, and basically the most important thing it says, that we've said several times already, that you must set your payment standards based on smaller FMRs, and generally speaking, those are going to be between 90 and 110% of the small area FMR, but can be outside the range if you have HUD approval. So there also are some built-in protections. So during the first year of implementation, no small area FMR will be less than 90% of the metropolitan FMR. So the most that a FMR can go down is 10%. And then in subsequent years, also, small area FMRs will not be lower than 90% of the prior year's small area FMR. So there is some protection in rental markets that are struggling, where costs may be going down, or rental costs, that is. So setting payment standards. Housing authorities currently can and will still be able to continue to request exception payment standards that exceed 110%, even after your conversion to small area FMR. You'll have to use the guidance that's in place. The current guidance to request a payment standard set at 120%, it's set to expire before the mandatory implementation date. So everyone should be mindful of what its policies are as of October 1 for requesting payment standards outside the range. It's also important to know in your jurisdiction what are the success rates of your voucher holders, where are your rent burden families. You may not know this immediately. But this is data you should definitely start tracking at a zip code level after your conversion, so that you know over time whether or not there is a need to request exception payment standards outside of the 90 to 110% range for the small area FMRs. Because of the variability of FMRs by zip code, I haven't experienced a lot of need to ask for even higher payment standards, because the variability by zip code does address some of the market challenges. But it's possible in your community that you could still have success rate challenges or rent burden families in certain zip codes. So written notice. This is important. Any family who is going to experience a reduction in their housing assistance payment due to the change in payment standard. So any household who their payment standard is going to go down, they need to have written notice, and it should be a very simple and clear letter to the family. So a good best practice is to do this, to give the notice as part of your annual re-exam letters. So one of the requirements is that households have to have at least 12 months notice of the effective date of any lower payment standard. So at their first annual re-exam, the family's guaranteed to be held harmless, and the current payment standard in place would continue to be used in circumstances where the payment standard is going down. So that is a requirement. You must give the families 12 months notice, but it's really important that the language be in a good, clear language that defines what a payment standard is, explains how it impacts the family, lets them know who to contact if there are any questions. And this can be confusing, especially in a time period where, or any re-exam where there could be lots of things going on with the re-exam. It's not just payment standard that's changing. It could be utility allowances. It could be income or other household circumstances. And then also as a reminder, all of your communications should be handicap accessible, particularly for those persons with hearing or visual impairments. And you should also make sure all of your communications comply with your limited English proficiency plan. So what do you do if it's a payment standard decrease? There are 3 options. So I just saw in the question in the chat, can I provide examples of the required written notices to families? We may, if we're able to get a sample, we will. However, I will say that part of the future HUD TA is going to provide quite a bit of sample documentation. So we may not be able to get it today, but I will tell you it's upcoming in the coming months. But back to this. What if small FMRs are going to result in reduced payment standards in certain zip codes? What are your options? The first option is called hold harmless. You can adopt an admin plan policy that says as long as the family remains in the same unit with the same household composition, that they're held harmless, meaning that there would be no payment standard reduction if nothing else changes for the household. Of course, if they move or if their composition changes requiring a different payment standard, then you would apply the new one. But that is, so you can have a hold harmless provision. It's explained in more detail in the 2018 notice, and it should be in your admin plan. You could also use some discretion to do a gradual phase down deduction of the payment standard over a period of time. But again, there must be 12 months notice. So your first re-exam, there would be no change. So if you're deciding to do a phase down, it would start at the second regular re-examination after the effective date of the payment standard. And again, if you want to use a gradual reduction policy, it should be in your administrative plan. I would just say from experience, I think a gradual reduction is probably the most challenging option of the three to administer, but it also may help ease the burden on families. And then finally, no change. You can just decide that you're going to use the new lower payment standard effective at the second annual re-exam. Again, it is very important that you give 12 months written notice. And then as a reminder, the small area FMRs will never change will never be 90%, less than 90% of the prior year. Your payment standard, depending on your policy and how you implement it, could change, but the small area FMRs themselves will never be less than 90% of the prior years. That is one of the built-in protections. So again, this is going to, since you must have your payment standards using small area FMRs in effect for January 1, 2025, you will start your re-exams in January of 2025 will impact any new admission, any family that moves, anyone that has a household composition. But for families for whom there's no change during 2025, you'll be giving your 12 months notice. And for those families, the implementation will start in 2026, from no later than 2026 from a practical standpoint. So adopting small area FMRs, there are several factors that things you need to do as you plan and look at your payment standards. Whatever you decide to do for policy-wise, you need to make sure it's in your administrative plan. But here's the important things you need to do. You need to analyze your payment standards. So if the small area FMR for a particular zip code means that your current payment standard is going to be outside of the 90 to 110% range, you need to know that so you know what adjustments may need to be made. You do need to make a decision regarding whether or not you're going to apply small area FMRs to your project-based voucher program. And I'm going to delve into that in a little while. You do have to determine if there are any places where there is a higher exception payment standard that's already in place. I know back in 2018 when this happened, there were some of those communities had 50% percentile exception payment standards already in place that were even higher than 110% of the small area FMR. So in those communities, a request was made for HUD to continue to use those exception payment standards until the small area FMRs caught up with them. And then it's important to know that the small area FMRs apply, not excluding project-based vouchers, which we'll talk about, but this applies to all your special purpose vouchers. So in addition to your normal tenant-based vouchers, if you have a mainstream program, a VASH program, any of those other special purpose programs, the small area FMRs do apply to them as well. So portability. A common question that we've heard is, how do small area FMRs affect portability? Basically, the payment standard policies of the receiving PHA are what apply, not the sending. So if the receiving PHA uses small area FMRs, that is the basis for payment standards, even if the family ported from a jurisdiction that does not use small area FMRs. And conversely, if a PHA is porting from a small area FMR community to one that does not use them, again, the metropolitan area FMRs apply to payment standards. Some other things you're going to want to consider that we're going to talk about is zip code groupings. You may have a lot of zip codes. We talked about an example earlier that the metropolitan area had 150 zip codes. That may be entirely too many different payment standards to administer. So you do have the ability to look at zip codes with similar SAFMR structures and do some groupings to make it simpler. You should use the HUD 2-year tool, the HUD tool of tools, which are on the HUD website, to do some analysis. Say, how might this affect your current program? If you're going to have some higher payment standards in some jurisdictions and lower in others, because that's going to tell you how your funding utilization might be impacted. Is your HAP expense going to go up? Will it go down? Will it net out? And every housing authority is going to be impacted slightly differently. I've already mentioned the 3 options for tenant protections and what to do with your payment standard reductions. So you do need to make sure you determine which policy you want to adopt and make sure it becomes part of your administrative plan. And then we're going to delve into your decisions around PBV, whether to use small SAFMRs or not, in just a few minutes. So this is actually an example from the SAFMR guidebook to show groupings. So in this case, this example shows that while there were 6 zip codes, there were 3 groupings of similar amounts. So this is just an example of how you could consolidate and have less groups of payment standards and less payment standards to manage, and therefore reduce your risk of mistakes when processing. Reasonable accommodation request. Common question that we've heard is, what will happen to people who need a reasonable accommodation and need a payment standard that's above 110%? The current rules still apply. Once you convert to smaller area FMRs, if you need a higher payment standard as a reasonable accommodation of disability, you can, on a case-by-case basis, go up to 120% of the smaller area FMR without HUD approval. And with HUD approval, you can even go above 120% of the small area FMR. Project-based vouchers. You do not have to use small area FMRs in your PBV program. And you need to give this a lot of thought to make sure you're making the best decision for your community and the goals the community has for the use of project basing. So most important thing is whatever decision you make must be in your administrative plan. And if you decide that you want to use small area FMRs for the project-based voucher program, you're going to have to apply this policy uniformly for all PBV awards that you make once you've adopted the policy change. You have to be consistent. You cannot choose what's ever most advantageous for either site. So, and I'll give an example of a community that I worked with, 2 different communities I worked with. One which was really trying to use PBV to make sure that the affordable units could be developed in some of their higher rent communities. They elected to use small area FMRs so there could be higher approvable rent structures, which would make developing affordable units in their more expensive zip codes more appealing and more marketable. I worked with another community that was really working hard to revitalize some distressed neighborhoods and wanted project-based vouchers and developing decent, safe, affordable housing units in some distressed neighborhoods to be part of that project. Using small area FMRs would have reduced the maximum rents to the PBV program and therefore made developing new affordable units in those areas infeasible. So there was a decision that they wanted to continue to use the metropolitan FMRs for their PBV program across the board to make sure that their revitalization goals got met. So common question, well, what if you decide to go to small area FMRs for your project-based voucher units, can you apply them to your existing contracts? Well, you can. It has to be at the mutual agreement of the owner. If it's going to result in a rent increase, it would go into effect at the next contract anniversary date. And remember, just because you're using small FMRs and the rent could be increased, that doesn't mean you're allowed to. Rent reasonableness will always still apply. But also, once you've decided to use small area FMRs for a PBV site, you cannot revert back on that site. Even if you decide to change your policy later to go back to future project-based sites having the metropolitan area FMRs. So what is the impact of adopting small area FMRs for project-based vouchers? There's some pretty complicated decisions you need to make to determine whether it's going to be beneficial. And one of the things you're going to need to do is look at what are your contract rents for your PBV units, and what could the contract rents potentially be with small area FMRs. There's a slew of reasons you need to know that. They include your budget concerns and the budget concerns for the operator of the property. So here's an example where a small area FMR could result in a higher rent. In this case, in these zip codes in this example, you could certainly get a higher maximum approvable rent to the owner using small area FMRs. Again, it could make developing units more appealing. It could result in a PBV project pro forma that can support more debt. However, similarly, it's going to affect your program cost, whereas in this example, your metropolitan area FMRs would certainly result in a lower HAP cost for you. Well, here's the converse, where the metropolitan area FMRs are higher than the small area FMRs. So again, your maximum rents to owners are going to be much higher. So again, you need to know this, so you know how it affects your program, how it affects the owners, so you can make the best decision for your agency and the goals that you have for PBV. And these could include both initiatives for private developers, but they could also, if you're a PHA that's using project-based vouchers to redevelop your own public housing properties as part of some Section 18 disposition and some asset repositioning, the policy that you set is going to could affect you directly. So what are some of the impacts on stakeholders that we need to consider? If you decide to use SAFMRs, you could have stakeholders in different jurisdictions that are going to want you to explain why. Why is my rent structure different from my neighbor's rent structure? Why can you approve a higher rent for them than you can for me, or vice versa? It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. It's something you should need to be prepared for, that you may need to justify varying rent structures. You may get pressure from an owner to terminate a contract because they feel like they could get a higher rent without the SAFMRs. You could get premature pressure to extend a contract because SAFMR rents are very generous. And all of these things could affect the tenants as well as lenders and investors. And one thing that's really important, if you elect to go to small FMRs for PBV units as a cost savings measure, it could affect the appraised value, because some appraisals are based on the revenue a project can generate. So if your policy results in lower rents, it could mean at some point in time when an owner wants to leverage debt or re-syndicate and obtain new tax credits, that their appraised value may be less, and it could affect their ability to obtain outside funding in order to have a new transaction. So I know we've covered a lot. I understand that you probably want more resources to be available. So the first thing I want to tell you is, please be sure, as you're moving forward through this process, to review PIH Notice 2018-01, but focus on the requirements for mandatory adoption of small area FMR. That notice also includes some requirements for housing authorities that are opting in. The HUD Exchange has a lot of good information. There are already FAQs. Somebody asked earlier about sample documents. There are already several sample documents and case studies from housing authorities that have implemented that might be useful to help you with policy decisions. And most important, it is going to be updated, but the implementation guidebook that's currently on the HUD Exchange is very good. And I encourage you to read it and to follow it as you're making decisions on how to implement. As we already showed you the small area FMR lookup tool that shows you how to access any current and prior years information about small area FMRs in every metropolitan area. And then PIH Notice 2023-07 does talk about the special fees that are going to be made available for adopting small area FMRs and also any related exception payment standards. There is also a small area FMR dashboard that rolled out in August of last year, and it'll tell you which housing authorities have adopted small area FMRs, how many programs. So if you already have housing authorities that you're networking with, peers that you share information with, this might be a place to look to see if one of your peers has already done this and can share information. This dashboard has lots of links to guidance and regulations, some videos that are expanding on what I'm saying today, links to some other webinars that were already considering small FMRs, and links to all the materials I mentioned on the HUD Exchange. And there are even profiles on some best practices from prior implementation and information on smaller area FMR research and reports. Technical assistance. I want everyone to know that today is not the end. Today's the beginning. HUD is committed to providing as many resources as they can to make this a smooth transition. Today we have our virtual convening, and the video will be posted on the HUD Exchange. There we will be adding an FAQ. But in addition, Mr. Minacchio mentioned the communities of practice. So HUD will be in upcoming weeks rolling out a communities of practice where there will be housing authorities who are your peers who have already implemented small FMRs who will be available to share best practices and work with you for problem solving. There's going to be additional webinars that will delve into the topics we discussed today in even more detail. And for any of you that really need a more hands-on approach, HUD is making direct technical assistance available to the housing authorities in the 41 mandatory areas. And I cannot reiterate it enough. The implementation guidebook, it's going to be updated, but even as it currently exists, it is very good. One other thing, as Mr. Minacchio mentioned, that there is mentorship through the communities of practice. HUD is creating the mentor program that will allow housing authorities to share their knowledge and experience, provide some support to this group where you need it for your planning and your data analysis, things you may need to do to update your systems of records, improve your quality control, share any tools and forms they use, and basically share any other, and this will also be a place for PHAs to share ideas. So before we go to break, we are going to open it up for an unplanned Q&A.
All right, Michael, do you want to start with addressing that question about the concern about tenants experiencing hardship, or do we want to address that one a little bit later?
Well, I don't remember the question, but basically the rule, each PHA needs to analyze whether or not there are going to be residents in small area FMR areas, particularly those where there's a decrease, that could experience a hardship based on implementation. As a reminder, it's not after the first year, it's after the second year. They would look at that and decide what policy you want to use, whether or not you want to consider having a hold harmless policy. I will acknowledge that it does. I have experienced that in some communities where families tend to search in some of the more distressed areas, it may result in less units being available at the payment standard. But I think the key to the hardship issue is making sure you adopt the right policy on how you want to implement the change for families who are in place.
All right, great. And let's go ahead and move on then back to that PBV question, because I know we just discussed PBV. So if a PHA decides to convert a portion of their HCV to PBVs, are those PBVs going to be subjected to use SAFMRs? If so, can they be offered to the project at 120% SAFMR, or would it have to be at 110%?
Okay. Well, there's two questions. The first is that the housing authority has the discretion to decide whether you want to use SAFMRs or metropolitan FMRs in the PVV program, and you need to look at it based upon your goals. If you're the maximum rents in the PVV program tend to be 110% of the applicable FMR, unless you have approval to go to a higher payment standard for your tenant-based voucher program. So you can't approve PVV rents at 120% of a small area FMR if you don't have approval in your voucher program as a whole. But if you have approval in your voucher program to go above 110%, it's applicable to the PVV program.
And now we have a question about units. It says, what happens to units that are currently in a higher FMR?
So the concern here is that the payment standard is going to go down. So you can't, there's two things you need to analyze, because you may decide you may want to be at 110% of the small area FMR to get as close as possible. But again, the key here is to analyze who's affected and how, and to determine what the right policy is for hold harmless. Do you want to implement the new payment standards at second re-exams? Or for families who stay in place and have no household change, do you want to have a hold harmless or gradual reduction policy? And you have to analyze your data, see what the impact is, and make a decision that's right for your PHA to protect those in-place families.
And so we have another question here. It says, we currently have a waiver to 120% of FMR for 2024. Will we be able to continue in October when we move to SAFMRs?
And unfortunately, unless someone from HUD can answer differently, we don't know whether those waivers are going to get extended beyond October 1. So at this point in time, I would advise you to proceed as if that waiver is expiring, unless HUD issues some guidance that's more favorable down the road.
Michael, that's correct. And I'm sorry, I should have introduced myself. My name is Allison Bell, and I'm a policy advisor in the Office of Housing Vouchers at HUD. The waiver is currently for FY24 fair market rents and small area FMRs. And what the waiver did was provide a simpler process for doing an exception payment standard over 110%. But prior to that waiver notice, you always could request to go over 110%. So whether or not that same waiver notice is republished, and that waiver notice has been published 3 times now, without regard to whether that waiver notice is updated and extended, you always can request an exception payment standard over 110%. So we see lots of questions in the chat about, what's going to happen in our areas where the small area FMR is lower than the FMR. And we certainly, see your questions and are listening and understand that can be challenging. There are, many ways to try and mitigate that impact. One is through the hold harmless policy, where families currently on your program that are residing in these areas don't ever have to decrease the payment standard for those families in their current unit. I know you might also be concerned about enticing new landlords in those areas, and that's where, setting your small area FMR at the max of the basic range, or if you have a compelling reason to request an exception payment standard, you can go ahead and request exception payment standards without regard to that waiver notice. That flexibility is in program regulations already. And just the other thing I'd note is when Peter Kahn was talking about the small area FMR research, there was no difference in families' ability to use their voucher. The success rate was the same. So there is experience, and we're going to hear from 3 really great PHAs here in just a bit. They're going to talk about their experiences, dealing with these same issues in the last cohort. And I acknowledge that the decrease in the payment standard can be challenging, but also that families have, on the whole, been able to continue to lease units in the other 24 metropolitan areas that are doing small area fair market rents. partially through implementing some of these mitigation standards and strategies, and making sure, like Michael's saying, to analyze the data, really figure out who's being impacted and what you can do to mitigate those concerns, while you're also sorting through the impacts on your budget. Because we've also seen the comment in the chat of concerns about how this will exacerbate HAP concerns. And I know one of our presenters is going to talk a little bit more about how they manage that. So definitely just wanted to acknowledge all of the great questions in the chat, in the Q&A around these issues. We hear you, and hopefully our presenters this afternoon will touch on some of it, but we also welcome, if we have not touched on your question about mitigating some of the concerns, we welcome you to submit the question again, and we will be happy to try and answer that this afternoon. All right, Michael, sorry for rambling.
No, thank you very much. That was a much better answer than I gave. So, what's our next question, Jesse?
All right, so the next question is, how do you find out the specific zip code that HUD has identified as needing an SAFMR?
There's two parts to this question. You can look up an SAFMR for any metropolitan area by going to huduser.gov, clicking on data sets and clicking on FMR and choosing your community. They're published for every metropolitan area. It doesn't tell you whether a specific zip code is required to use a small area FMR. In order to know what metropolitan service areas are in small area FMR zip codes, you need to go to the PHA notice. But you need to go to the mandatory implementation notice, states which metropolitan areas must use FMRs by zip code.
All right, and then we have a question here. It says, with the current SAFMR, they are reporting that in many of the zip code areas, the VPS appears to be lower than it is with setting VPS at 110% of the FMR. And so in those cases, does the housing authority still have to use the SAFMR?
Yes, so the notice requires that small area FMRs be used as the basis for setting payment standards, even in those cases where the small area FMR is lower than the metropolitan FMR. So the important thing here is to set the housing authority's payment standard policy for families that are in place to make a determination of what you want to do, whether you want those lower payment standards to go into place at the second annual reexam, or if you want to have policies that hold harmless or phase in the change. But the setting of payment standards at the small area FMR level is mandatory per the HUD notice, whether or not it is, if you're in a mandatory area, it is required, whether or not that results in higher or lower payment standards.
All right, and then we have a question here about zip codes. So what happens if a zip code crosses a county line where the zip code extends out of the MSA? Can the SAFMR extend across the full zip code in that case?
That is a fantastic question that we may have to look into unless our friends from HUD have an answer that's readily available.
Sorry, Michael, I have recently looked into this and I think I know the answer, but I think we should just make sure we're 100% right, and we will answer that one in writing.
And it looks like here we have an attendee who wants to come on and ask their question verbally.
We have a special program, community choice demonstration, and we had to get a waiver to do the fair market rents. We got an exception. We used the small area fair market rents along with census tracts to get that information. Could we use that across the board and get an exception to the SMR across our HCB program?
If you're in an MTW community that already has an alternative payment standard structure that is approved in your MTW plan and in place, that is allowed to stay in place. So, Alice, is there anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, so Les is an old friend with the Nashville, the Metropolitan MDHA there in Nashville, and they're participating in the community choice demonstration. And I think his question is, can we use census tract based payment standards, even if we're a mandatory small area FMR PHA, where the mandatory small area FMR or the small area FMR is calculated at the zip code level, they're interested in using an even smaller geography to set their payment standards. And the short answer to that is yes, you can use census tract based payment standards. It has to be within the basic range of the zip code. And that gets a little bit tricky, but the short answer is yes, you can use census tract based payment standards, and you don't need an exception payment standard approval to do that unless you're going outside the basic range, which tends to happen. Our colleague, Kim Longwell from Allegheny County, she's going to talk a little bit more about census tract based payment standards in her presentation this afternoon, Les. And so we certainly will talk to you more specifically about the community choice demonstration, but I did want to say, yes, that's a possibility. That might be a little overwhelming for folks who are moving from an FMR to zip code based rents to think about even more options. But yes, that is a thing that you can do.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that question. Under the SAFMRs, will the payment standards stay to 110% if that is what the PHA is currently using?
Well, the PHA, each PHA should analyze what payment standards could look like using smaller FMRs and decide what you want to do. You may decide that you want to use 110% in every zip code. You may decide that in some zip codes, 110% is too high and you want to do something lower. So you really need to analyze your data and make a decision that's right for you and adjust your administrative plan accordingly.
And then here we have a question regarding the applicability of SAFMRs to COC program vouchers. And so they were wondering who they should check with to see how to streamline some of these changes and how to best address and make sure everything stays consistent.
Well, that's an excellent question. So this SAFMR rollout notice was very clear that it only applies to the voucher program. And I don't want to misspeak. I'm not sure if the other programs even give you the flexibility to use the SAFMRs. So you're going to need to reach out to your applicable HUD contacts for the COC programs, who may be different from our friends who are here on this meeting for PIH. They can provide the right guidance on what to do, whether you're allowed to align or whether whether or not you need to use a separate thing, specifically whether or not you need to use the FMRs in your COC and other HUD programs.
We have a question here about the impact of SAFMRs on how HUD publishes QCTs and DDAs.
That, unless one of our friends from HUD can provide an answer, that is probably something we need to table that can't be answered in this forum.
All right, great. So we will answer that question more fully in the FAQ document. So thank you for that question. And so we're going to be answering just a couple more. I know we have a lot of questions. We're going to be answering a couple of more and then we'll go to break. So this is a question about planning. So it says, if the 2025 SAFMRs aren't available, how would the PHA be able to determine if the payment standard will be lower and then be able to announce 12 months before the effective date?
So there's a couple things in that question. So first of all, you can look now to see whether or not it's likely. You can compare current fair market rents to current small area FMRs. So you can get an idea of where it's going to be. But come October 1 of this year, you should know whether your payment standards are going down in particular zip codes or going up. So at that point in time, as you process your re-exams, you can give your 1-year notice to those families that payment standards are decreasing in this jurisdiction, and that in 1 year, and you want to be careful in how you phrase the letter, that in 1 year your payment standard may be lower. we really, it's a fair concern. I've seen that happen where payment standards initially go down, but over time they go back up again as rental conditions change. But you will know enough to give the 1 year notice come October 1, because you'll know what the new metropolitan FMRs are and what the new small area FMR are. So you can, if at that point in time it's resulting in a decrease, those are the affected families that you would want to give a notice to.
Okay, and then we have another question here about the notice, Michael. So it says, if we choose hold harmless, do we still need to send a written notice 12 months in advance?
If you're electing hold harmless, you would not be required to send a notice because the payment standards are not decreasing for those households. You probably need to make, it is important though, because you do need to make sure that as you're briefing new families that come on the program or advising families who have requested to move, they do need to know about the change. Because in a particular zip code, they may be used to you assisting based upon a certain payment standard that if they decide to move may no longer be the case. So again, there is no required notice if you're using hold harmless, but you do need to be prepared to brief your voucher holders accordingly so they know what to expect.
Okay, let's move on to the next one. So here we see, in cases where a section of the PHA service area is located in an MSA and part of it is not, is implementation limited to just the zip codes within the MSA and not the entire service area? And in this particular case, they stated that they serve 12 counties, and only one of those 12 are listed in an MSA.
So the answer is you only have to implement small area FMRs when you're in a designated small area FMR area and just for that area. So let's say you're a statewide PHA and your state has 30 counties and only 3 of those counties are in a designated small area FMR area. You only have to do the small area FMRs in the designated small area FMR areas. You can elect to do small area FMRs everywhere else. You can opt in fully to small area FMRs for the other areas, or you could do exception payment standard based small area FMRs, but you're only required to do small area FMRs in those 41 designated metropolitan areas.
Okay, and here we have another question about PBV, Michael. It says, if a PHA chooses to do an SAFMR, does that exception for 120% PBB approval have to come from HUD, or does it only have to be in the PHA's administrative plan?
In the PBB program, generally speaking, a PHA is authorized to approve rents that are reasonable. PBB rents must always be rent reasonable, that go up to 110% of the applicable fair market rent. So if you're going to small area FMRs, you could go to 110% of the small area FMR. However, if you have a HUD approval to go to 120% of your small area FMR for that zip code, then you can approve PBB rents up to 120%, assuming they're rent reasonable. Your maximum payment standard and your maximum gross rents in the PBB program have to be consistent. You can't go to 120% in your PBB program if you don't have authorization to do so in your tenant-based program.
All right, great. And it looks like we're almost at 3 o'clock and ready for our break. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Allison Bell. She wanted to give us a little bit more information about the communities of practice. And then after that, we will go to break. Allison?
Yeah, thank you, Jesse. Thanks everyone who has joined today for asking so many really great questions. I really like what Michael said earlier about how this is just the beginning. So, please be assured we're going to try to answer as many questions as you have today, but as you get closer and closer to when you really have to implement, we know that there's going to be, more and more questions that come up. So we really are excited to offer quite a bit of technical assistance through our technical assistance partner, CVR. And particularly, we're excited about these communities of practice, we're just starting to take shape. And so before we go on break or while we are on break, if your PHA is interested in joining the community of practice, we'd really welcome you putting your name and your PHA and some contact information in the chat if you'd like to join. There's different kinds of PHAs on the line today, those that have previously implemented small area FMRs, and you are very welcome to join these communities of practice. So newer agencies can learn from you, and newer agencies, you are very welcome to join. So any kind of PHA that is interested is welcome to join, and we encourage you to put your name, your PHA, and some contact information in the chat if you're interested in this. You could also email us at smallarea.fmrs@hud.gov if you're interested and you don't want to throw your name in the chat today. And we will be in contact at some point in the near future about how to access additional technical assistance. I'd seen that in the chat, and how to join this community of practice. We have a lot more information coming about how you can get more information from HUD and our technical assistance providers on small area FMRs. So with that, Jesse, I'll turn it back to you to give us some instructions for the break.
All right, great. So next we're going to be taking a break, and we're actually going to be, we're going to put in the chat the time by which to come back, which it looks like it's going to be 3:15, so it'll be a 15-minute break. All right, it is 3:15 Eastern Time, so we're going to be coming back from our break now. And so before we get started, just another reminder that you are free to insert your questions in the chat while the presentation is going on, because there will be another Q&A session that's going to occur once we move through the next portion of the presentation. So again, you can insert your questions into the chat panel at any point, and then we will try to address it later during the next Q&A session. And so now I'm going to toss it back over to Michael Tonovitz, because the next section of the presentation, we're going to be hearing from 3 PHAs and their best practices and how they dealt with SAFMRs. Michael?
Thank you, Jesse. So we're going to talk about 3 best practices from 3 different housing authorities. We'll have the Plano Housing Authority in Plano, Texas, the Boston Housing Authority, and the Allegheny Housing Authority, which is in Pennsylvania, in the Pittsburgh metropolitan area. So we're going to start out by talking about technology and software, because obviously a change in policy affects how your systems operate. Our first presenter is David Young, the Executive Director of the Plano Housing Authority, because the Plano Housing Authority was part of the first wave of mandatory implementation in 2018. And David's been in the industry a long time with extensive knowledge of the voucher program, as well as a great deal of expertise with public housing authority softwares and implementations. So I'm going to turn it over to David so he can tell us about his experiences and best practices from the Plano Housing Authority.
Thank you, everybody. As it was brought up before, we were one of the very first to implement this. HUD told us to do it back in 2010, 2011 time period. It was a big switch for us, and it took a lot of getting adjusted to. And just so y'all would know, prior to coming to the Housing Authority, I was one of the trainers for one of the big software companies as well. So what I really tried to do was to go through this and make sure that as you start thinking about things, you have to think about how it's going to affect 2 things, your software and your budget, because both of those are going to be huge in this whole process. Our housing authority, we run a 25-mile radius. That means we cover the entire Dallas Metroplex. To put it in perspective, we are currently at 174 zip codes. And yes, we do those at the SAFMR level. I'll get into that in just a little bit. We cover HCB vouchers, mainstream, VASH. We also did a small RAD conversion as well. Previously, like the rest of the housing authorities, we ran it at 90 to 110 based on market conditions and the unit availability, because that's always what you have to take into consideration. When you start looking at how you're going to implement these, how you group them or separate them is going to control your entire world. You got to think about a couple of different things. There are some agencies right around me that do them in groups. And it's just like they sound. They will break them up geographically. That's fine if that works for them, but you have got to always remember when you talk about doing a group, you're most likely then going to be using some type of an averaging methodology to come up with how much you're going to set those payment standards. And when you do an average, you always end up throwing out the top end. That alone defeats the purpose of the SAFMR. Now, the other way to do that is to take them all up to the top end. That's another problem because you are still bound to that 90 to 110% when you set your payment standards off of the SAFMR. So you've got to take all that into consideration. When we looked at all of that, that's how we came up with the thought process of we're going to run these at exactly the SAFMR for the first year or so to see how it affects us, and then look at our budget as well. One important thing to think about this too, when a voucher holder is out searching, it's very easy for them to use any smartphone and just say, hey Siri, what zip code am I in? And she'll turn around and she'll tell you that. And it's a good resource to then be able to utilize as you're going back and forth in your charts. Zip codes are strange. Some will stop on a street and across the street will be a different zip code. And it's a challenge. Here we cover 25 miles. It is huge. And it was a little bit of a challenge to bring the tenants on board, to bring the landlords on board, and even bring your staff on board, because that's another issue you've always going to have to consider. How you group these or how you don't group these is important. It's going to affect your HAP one way or the other. Our net effect here, because we are also in the perfect storm of the Dallas Metroplex, our rents are going crazy. The SAFMRs can't even keep up with the HAP and with the crazy rents right now. But at least having the extreme high-end areas, when our voucher holders have the ability to move to them, this gives them somewhat of a chance to be able to get into them. If I was to group them, it would automatically block them out of those high-end areas. The budget and how this is going to affect you individually as a housing authority, there are so many factors you're going to have to consider. Always, your admin that you earned is based on the number of families that you house. Doesn't change under this analogy. When your HAP goes up, you're probably going to hit a ceiling. You're going to have to give yourself a little bit of leeway. Historically, most of us have tried to use a 2 to 3% variance. You're going to have to increase that. Here's why. In our area alone, our SAFMRs can vary 100%. That means I don't know where somebody's going to lease up. If that person takes that voucher and goes to the top end area, that could be worth 2 vouchers at the low end area. That right there makes budgeting and calculation, it's a challenge. I'm not going to lie. Your 2-year tool is not set up for it. The reason why, it's always used the analogy of a 1-bedroom voucher is worth $600. A 2-bedroom is worth $800. You don't know that now. You don't know where they're going to lease up. You need to really look at this. If you can export your current active tenants out, throw them into an Excel database, and then turn around and overlay those SAFMRs, it's going to give you a ballpark idea about how you're going to be affected. The reason why it's so broad there, you don't know how much of that increase is going to go to the HAP, how much is going to go to the tenant. It's a hard analogy to find until you've really been through this a little bit. After 14 years and rising rents, I can tell you our HAP has increased. When your HAP goes up, your admin can go down. You have to think about these kinds of things and be prepared. Watch them. Get on a first name basis with your FMC coordinator. Make sure you know how much HAP you got in the bank, how much HAP HUD is holding and is going to be made available to you. You've got to really look at your numbers now. From a software perspective, one of the things we talked about previously was portability in, portability out. Y'all know, usually we get a lot of emails or faxes or even phone calls. Somebody is wanting to port in and they've been told, ask how much your payment standard is. I don't know. The most I can do is direct them to our website and say, a 2-bedroom voucher is worth fill in the blank. Look at the zip code. So if they are being limited and being told they can only go someplace where the payment standard is equal to or there's going to be absorbed, it could actually reduce the number of ports. Again, you don't know where they're going to lease up. On your website, put that data there. And if you want to get a ballpark idea about what I did, go to our website, take a look at it. You'll kind of get an idea about, after 14 years, a lot of the common questions that we get, I now put out there. Same goes for that chart. When I cover 174 different zip codes, look, it's not rocket science. I make a very quick chart that says, here's the zip codes in numerical order. Here's how much the SAFMR is. It starts at a 0-bedroom, goes all the way up to a 6. I can't tell you what your voucher's worth because I don't know where you're going to lease up. However, if you're in this zip code, here's how much it's worth. The landlords will very quickly figure this out. The apartment complexes will very quickly set their rents to get all the way to the dollar what they can get. It's a business. We've watched it happen. And that is the intent of the SAFMR in the first place, allowing folks to be able to go to areas of opportunity. The flip side is those landlords take advantage of the opportunity and set their rents as high as they can. Yes, it still has to be considered rent reasonable. Here in our area, that's really not an option because the rents are going up so fast that the SAFMRs are actually able to cap it. Having said all of that, not only are you having to train your tenants and your landlords, you're going to have to train your staff. This is a huge change. When we first started this, we had to keep double checking move-ins, double checking annuals, really looking at transfers. Are we using the right payment standard for that unit? We ought to turn around and actually implement an internal auditing that we were looking at even more files than normal because we wanted to make sure we were using the right numbers. No matter how you look at this, you've still got to make sure you're pulling the right number. You're going to make mistakes. It's going to happen. When you find them, fix them. The sooner your staff gets into the rhythm of looking at these charts, it will help you out. You're going to have the constant question from voucher holders. How much is my voucher worth? Where can I move? Refer back to this chart. It's the only way it's going to make any sense to anybody. You're going to come up with a lot of printed materials for your tenants, for your landlords, and for your staff. They're going to cover that here in just a little bit, but you need to be prepared. When HUD is talking about giving you $10,000 to help implement this, this is where it's going to start going. printed materials, website additions. It's going to help offset it. Our staff picked it up probably within about the first 90 to 100 days. Quite honestly, that was the learning curve. There are some periods of time when you're about to implement next year's SAFMRs, you got to be careful. Because am I doing a move-in that's taking nows, or am I doing an annuals that's going to affect the next one? Really, it's no different than the FMRs that we're dealing with right now. The only difference is you're just having to go a little more detailed down to the zip code or group level, however you want to do it. I know it's a lot to throw at everybody, but just think about these.
Well, thank you, Dave. That was very insightful. One thing that I just wanted to share with everybody before I move to the next presenter is, Rob, the sooner you can reach out to your software provider, the better. It is a really good idea to talk to them. Let them know what's coming. Many of the major software providers have already worked with PHAs that have implemented, but it's important that you talk to them, make sure your software can handle it or can be ready to handle it by October 1st, and also that you know what needs to be done, and you know what you need to teach your staff about how your software is going to handle using multiple payment standards, where currently you may just be using one regular payment standard and one exception payment standard. So, with that said, I want to move on to talk more about the tenant considerations. I wanted to introduce David Gleich, who's the Deputy Administrator of Housing Programs for the Boston Housing Authority. He has been in the business more than 20 years, is an expert in all things housing choice voucher, is actually very good at embracing how to use technology with the program. And most importantly, David is my friend. I look forward to hearing what David's about to tell us.
Thank you, Michael. Good to hear your voice and be part of a presentation with you again. My name's David Gleich. I've been at the Boston Housing Authority for several years now, and so we have similar to Dave in Texas. We've got a 30-mile radius surrounding Boston that we administer vouchers in, and that presents some challenges, but with respect to SAFMRs. But in addition, we were already in several different FMR areas prior to making the switch over to small area fair market rents. So we had multiple payment standards that we were dealing with in 9 different political metropolitan statistical areas. Which is, we've switched to SAFMRs now, and we're in 122 different zip codes. So of course, a huge increase in the number of payment standards that we're running now, but we were already familiar with administering in multiple payment standard areas. So the BHA's got a number of different voucher programs, the majority of them federal vouchers though, and we've got about 19,000 vouchers. Previously, we were at 110% of FMR to keep up with the rapidly increasing rents in the Boston metropolitan area. The BHA is a little bit different because we switched over to SAFMRs voluntarily. We're not in a mandatory area. And so we chose to implement in a way where we still keep FMRs in some zip codes. So we didn't have to suffer the decreases of the SAFMRs. And actually, we chose some zip codes that we wanted to give exception payment standards to. So we use exception payment standards in many of our zip codes that go up to 110% of the SAFMR. And a lot of the reason we went to SAFMR was to encourage people or to give people opportunities to move to areas that really were not served by vouchers at all. And, what we're seeing is because those areas where we've implemented SAFMRs were areas that don't have a lot of rental housing, we see some incremental changes to the portfolio. We don't see like rapid changes to our portfolio, people moving to suburban areas around Boston, where, even though the payment standards are much higher, there's just not a lot of rental housing. So we're seeing incremental changes. We're seeing people being able to move to neighborhoods that they weren't able to move to before, but we don't see like a rapid significant change since we implemented in 2019. So the focus of my presentation is really to talk about the tenant tools that we provided. And so we did a lot of thinking about what we were going to provide to tenants to help communicate the change. And number one is the payment standard charts and like what those charts would look like based on the in comparison to the prior charts. We also built several online tools. So we built an online rent calculator, and that's the rent calculator that we have online really speaks to a lot of the issues that Dave was speaking about. Like tenants are always asking, what's my voucher worth? What can I afford? Right. So we kind of have a what can I afford tool. And then we have some tools that help people decide on what neighborhood they want to live on. So we have an online tool that's kind of a neighborhood chooser, because we're very aware that a lot of our voucher holders, they know they can kind of take their voucher anywhere, but maybe they're only familiar with a couple of the inner city neighborhoods where really that were the only places that vouchers could be used previously because of affordability issues. And now there's like many more choices. So we've built a tool that kind of helps people explore different neighborhoods and potentially look at different apartments that might be within the payment standard in these different neighborhoods. And then there's some policy considerations that I'll get into at the close of my presentation as well. So this is just a look at our payment standard chart. And actually, you can look at these. These are on Boston Housing Authority's website. If you want to steal our chart design, that's fine. And we didn't do any grouping because actually our software, we discovered pretty early on that our software was pretty good at grabbing the correct payment standard based on the address. So if the zip code was entered correctly and the bedroom size was correct, then the software was going to pull in the correct payment standard. So we weren't too worried about grouping together. What we thought would be most helpful to our tenants would be to just give a list of all the cities that we would administer in alphabetical order and provide those zip codes. And you can see, like when we get down to Boston, we have several different Boston zip codes. And then across the top, we have the bedroom size. This resulted in actually, because we are in 122 different zip codes, a multiple page chart. We also did another chart that's just by bedroom size, which we can squeeze onto the front and the back of a page. So we broke this down into, all the bedroom sizes, and then a chart that just reflects the bedroom size that would represent the voucher size for the family, so that they can grab that chart off our website or in our offices. Obviously families know when they're searching how many bedrooms they got in their voucher, so they would just need that one chart. So obviously a lengthy list, but pretty clear and easy to pull the payment standard off of the chart. Like I said, we were already in this kind of world where we were pulling from 9 different PMSAs already. And actually our prior methodology was even more confusing because we had a list of just the different towns and which PMSA they were in. So you'd look at the town, and for example, it would say Boston would be in the PMSA 1, and then you'd have to reference a different chart which told you what the values were in 1. So actually going to SAFMRs for BHA was actually a reduction in the complexity of our payment standard charts. But again, these are on our website. If you go to bostonhousing.org/payment standards, you can pull these charts and get a better sense of the design of the charts. I already kind of touched on this stuff. Basically, our housing specialists are giving these charts to our clients as they indicate they want to search. They're also given out obviously at the briefing sessions. And as I mentioned, we can now squeeze if we do it by bedroom size, we can squeeze the charts onto the front and back of a single 8.5 by 11 page. And so this is a look at the chart. That's on the single 8.5 by 11 page. It just basically breaks it into 3 columns, and we get all 122 zip codes on there. So, obviously, if we're operating in a smaller area and not a 30-mile radius around the city, you might have many fewer zip codes. But if you're in a large metropolitan area, this is something that could be useful to your housing authority. So, as Dave was before me was referencing, the most common question you're going to get from tenants on this is like, what can I afford, right? If I go to this neighborhood, what can I afford? If I go to another neighborhood, is it going to be more? Is it going to be less? And so, the concept of payment standard is already confusing to participants. It's confusing to our staff. So I think it's just a kind of a confusing concept because obviously not only does it consider, it's a gross rent concept, right? You're considering the contract rent plus the utility allowance as kind of a subsidy ceiling. And so it's when you try to explain that to tenants, it doesn't always come through clearly. So the thing we thought that could be the most useful is to build a calculator, which we've done. So if you'd go to bostonhousing.org/rent, you'll see what we call kind of the max rent calculator. And the calculator considers everything that you'd want for the purpose of affordability. It builds in the BHA's utility chart. It builds in the BHA payment standards, which are those payment standards by zip code and SAFMRs. And we also we've built out an API to affordablehousing.com to pull in rent reasonableness data as well. So clients can go and put in a specific address, and if they know their gross rent, which we supply them, their gross income, which we supply them with, they can actually get a good sense of affordability for a prospective apartment. So here's a screenshot of what that calculator looks like. You can also go to bostonhousing.org/rent. And I would say that this tool is really the most valuable thing that we've put together for related to making or facilitating the switch to small area fair market rents. Not only do our landlords use it, our tenants use it, our landlords do as well, and so do our staff, just to get a quick eye on affordability. So you can see that the inputs that are required here, it's annual adjusted gross income, which we give people when we issue them a voucher, the owner's requested rent, the unit address, the zip code, the voucher size, the unit bedroom size, and then the unit type, which is the structure type, which ultimately drives the utility allowances. And then obviously we ask for the utility structure, what utilities is the landlord paying, and what utilities is the tenant going to pay. And then when you submit that, the tool comes back with an answer, tells the tenant or whoever's using the tool whether the apartment is affordable. If it goes outside the rent reasonableness guidelines, it will tell you that as well. And so it really is a pretty refined tool to drill down on affordability. And when you have so many payment standards, a tool like this is kind of really a very useful thing to have. I would recommend looking into kind of trying to build something out like this with the HUD funds that are available for implementation. So the other tool that we have developed, and this is really something we've been developing for several years now, and this is kind of the neighborhood search tool that I was talking about previously. And this was something when before the BHA converted to SAFMRs, we were trying to figure out how do we, allow people to move? How do we expand people's choices essentially? And so we started this program called Expanding Choices in Housing Opportunity. We call it the ECHO program. And we built a program of this web tool called the ECHO Locator that assists families with neighborhood search. It's very much built around some of the work that Raj Chetty, the Harvard economist, has done around neighborhood choice and what neighborhoods have the most positive outcomes for children in the long run. And so basically the tool allows folks to consider how important school quality is, how important public safety is, but also it allows them to look at different addresses that they might need to get to, whether it be work or child care provider or so on and so forth. And it kind of maps out which neighborhoods might be appropriate in the Boston metro area for families to choose. And so here's a kind of a look at the mobility tool and kind of an idea of what it does. So in the prior screen, actually, there's some inputs here, a couple different addresses. And then the outputs you'd get are these different neighborhood cards, and you can kind of keep going to different neighborhoods, but it gives you some neighborhood cards. And then if you go into the detail, we've actually set this software up to kind of look at different listings that BHA has in its own listing, but also we've got it connected to realtor.com to identify some potential units that fall within the BHA's payment standards. And so kind of here's a look at the details. When you click on one of those neighborhood cards from the prior screen, you can see like that if Brookline could potentially be a good neighborhood to get to this work location. You can see the quality of the schools, some information about public safety, and then you can see these various markers here, which all represent units that are available on realtor.com that fall underneath the at or below the payment standard for this particular neighborhood. And there's some other tools that we've built in as well, links to like Craigslist that do kind of like an automated search of apartments at or below the payment standard. Same thing for Zillow. And then there's another way, and then there's one for Go Section 8 and HotPads as well. So just different links to different rental websites once people kind of figure out a neighborhood that might be something they're interested in. And so this tool is really helpful. We actually, so with our Echo program, people that are interested in that program, we have kind of limited resources to help people, but as people are interested, we try to help them. We use this tool as a starter, and then we try to give them as much information as we can about the different neighborhoods surrounding Boston. And again, as I mentioned before, we've switched to SAFMRs. We've come up with these, I think, what are really great tools over time. And, again, the changes that we're seeing are moving in the right direction as intended by our policy, but also they are incremental. The majority of our residents are still living in the same neighborhoods in Boston that they lived in prior to those changes to SAFMR. You can also get to this website. You can check this website out. It's at echolocator.org. If you just wanted to explore it a little bit more, you can actually log in and peruse it and whatnot. So again, echolocator.org, you can check that out if you wanted to. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about some policy changes that we considered for participants as we implemented. Number one was a hold harmless policy. And so for BHA, we didn't want to push people out of the neighborhoods where they wanted to be. So a lot of our inner city neighborhoods would have suffered decreases due to SAFMRs, and we wanted to make sure that families weren't pushed out of those neighborhoods if they wanted to remain there. And so that hold harmless policy for BHA was very important to stick to. One thing I will mention is that you also want to talk to your software provider about how it will deal with the hold harmless policy, right? And think about things 2 years in advance when maybe your payment standards have changed a couple times, but you still want to maintain that person at the old payment standard, because like the current rule is that at the second annual following the change, right, your payment standard is going to increase. And so you just want to think about how your software is going to deal with that. And it's something you want to think about now because there might not be a problem immediately, but in a couple of years, there may be an issue there. The other piece was that we looked at different communities based on school quality, incidents of violent crime, and we established what we call expanded choice communities, ECCs. And we decided that once we established a community as an ECC, that kind of helped drive the way we set our payment standards. And so now we go to 105, and I think we're actually going to move to 110% of SAFMRs in those communities established as ECCs. If it's not an ECC, we don't set the payment standard as high. So that's another policy decision that we spend a lot of time thinking about. And then lastly, important with respect to these changes, that we give people a sufficient amount of time to search, recognizing that even though you have these, like now, in some neighborhoods, higher payment standards, and in other neighborhoods potentially lower payment standards, that it's not necessarily going to be easy for voucher holders to find apartments. There are other barriers that present themselves. We know certainly in the Boston area that voucher holders are discriminated against throughout the region, and so important to think about that when you think about how do you want to manage voucher search time and extension. Certainly at the Boston Housing Authority, we're very lenient with that. We give 120 days of initial search time and then an extension as needed, and then we look at reasonable accommodation after that. So that concludes my presentation. Thanks very much for listening, and I'm very glad to share with everybody, and hopefully this was helpful.
Well, thank you, David. So before we move on, I just wanted to make one comment. I think it's important that everyone who participates, think about what Boston Housing Authority's done. I understand some housing authorities, you're going to be smaller, you're going to have less zip codes, a smaller program, perhaps. So your ability to be more sophisticated, like the Boston Housing Authority, might be limited. There still can be pieces of what they've done that you can replicate. For example, making sure that your voucher holders know all of the available resources for housing search, making sure they have the right information to know how the payment standards vary by zip code. So everything that David showed, I think it's scalable. There are opportunities to replicate these best practices at any size housing authority. So next, I want to turn it over, and we're going to turn it over to talk a little more about the landlord outreach. I want to turn things over to Kim Longwell, the director of the Housing Choice Voucher Program at the Allegheny County Housing Authority. And Kim has also been in this industry a very long time and is an expert, and at Allegheny, they have done some very creative things using small area SAFMRs to promote housing mobility and expand housing choice. So with that said, I'll turn it over to you, Kim.
Thank you so much. Here we go. So we are Allegheny County, except for the city of Pittsburgh and McKeesport. We've got a little over 6,000 vouchers, and previously we were using the 90 to 110% of the payment standard, the market rent, fair market rents that we were using prior. So now we were one of the first mandatory areas that had to use these small area SAFMRs way back after the lawsuit. So we had more than 25% of 2,500 vouchers that were located with a high poverty census tract. The one problem that we had was we had 85 zip codes in our jurisdictions, which would have meant 85 separate small area fair market rents. And that was tough. That was very, very tough. What we tried to do, because 85 would have been crazy for an audit, for any type of administration work. So what we did was we grouped our zip codes into tiers if certain zip codes fit together. Part of the problem in Allegheny County is that we would have some zip codes that overlapped. For example, we have one zip code, 15025, that was with a place called Clairton, which is a very high poverty area. But 15025 was also Jefferson Hills, which was a very high opportunity area with great school districts. They had different school districts. So that was a lot of our problem. We had to go somewhere in the middle of those zip codes where that happened. And this happened in quite a few. So what we had to do is kind of decide where we were going to put them. Prior to that, we did have tiers. but we had tiers based on municipalities, and our municipalities were better for us because what we did was we looked at the school districts, the area. Our inspectors knew a lot because our inspectors had been there for quite a while. So when the small area fair market rents came into us, we really had to do some different things. We did choose to hold the tenants harmless, as I think most people do, and it was beneficial for the tenant and the landlord. The problem with that was it did cause confusion when tenants moved. They didn't know why payment standard was higher or lower. And when they think they're moving in the same area. And then the landlords would always say that, well, you gave me this rent last time, why aren't you giving it to me this time? Even though we had attempted to explain to them over and over. But we needed to inform them about the upcoming changes before we implemented the small area fair market rents. So what we did was we held group meetings for landlord service partners. We sent notices to everyone we could possibly think of. This was before we were really into the Zoom, so we did not have that. We had to have face-to-face meetings. We sent we would tell the participants, give them flyers. Yes, this is what's going to happen. And then we would have to answer phone calls because no matter how much you explain, some people they either don't get it, don't want to get it. So we were really jammed with phone calls from landlords. So patience was the key. Sometimes we had to switch staff out because patience kind of left a little bit for some people. But that's basically what we had to do there. When the NOFA came out for the community choice demonstration, we were so excited because that meant we got out of the small area fair market rents and we could go into different standards. So what we did was we partnered with our Housing Authority City of Pittsburgh and Allegheny Department of Human Services. And we all did the grant together. We got the grant. And then HUD gave us an exception payment standard for the higher cost neighborhoods. We sometimes go up to about 150% of the payment standard, sometimes 160, depending on the area. Our partner in the Department of Human Services developed a map. And what happens with this map is you just type an address in, and then that tells you what the payment standard is. It gives you a whole tier. This is what it is for this address. Because addresses, as someone had said before, they change. I mean, across the street, the census tract is one thing, next door is another, and it is very, very confusing. This map helps immensely. Any additional considerations I would say is keep the faith, keep pushing, keep being patient, because it is a lot for tenants, it's a lot for landlords, it's a lot for every participant involved, and that includes politicians because they get the calls too. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kim. This is Michael Tonovitz again. I'm just going to, before we open it up to question and answers, just some other things you may want to think about as you start this journey, based on some experiences we've had helping PHAs during the last round. So I do think it's very important that you communicate with your landlords, that you communicate with them in writing about the change and the impact. So on the screen, this is a sample letter that was used by a housing authority notifying all of the landlords in its jurisdiction about the change. So letting them know that when it was happening, that in some cases they'll go up, in some cases it will go down. In this particular sample notification, the PHA was using hold harmless. So we did actually take the time to explain that existing families won't be impacted. And finally, I mean, to reflect on something Kim said, trying to get out in front of it to let owners know that in some cases, rents that were previously approved might not be under the new small FMRs. And I understand as a voucher administrator, this is tricky because the rent could still be reasonable, but it could be now that the affordability rule, the 40% rule, means that there's nothing wrong with the rent, but it just doesn't meet the affordability calculations for the family. So again, the important thing, it is a good idea to communicate in writing. You're going to have to communicate the message over and over, but that's a good best practice to get a letter out. Some other things that we experienced is that in the areas where the payment standards are going down, owners are going to be confused. They don't understand why a rent used to be approvable, now it's being denied. So again, and it may be rent reasonable, but denied for affordability. So it's a good practice to have scripts for all your staff. So the staff are all providing the same message in the same manner to explain the policy change. And we have had some experiences with short-term reductions in available housing stock in zip codes where payment standards are decreasing. So it's also going to be important. You're going to need to increase your marketing in the lower payment standard areas. It sounds counterintuitive because you also are going to need to increase your marketing where payment standards are going up to try to access new landlords. But it's just as important to ensure that units are going to be available in some of the lower rent areas. So as I mentioned, increases, yes, you're going to want to do a lot more outreach. You may want to have landlord information sessions, reach out to any realtor or business associations in those particular zip codes that may help you to access some landlords that you have previously not been able to work with. Also, talk about a little more. David also mentioned it. You may want to explore implementing a housing mobility service. There could be potential community partners. For example, earlier in this presentation, we showed you small area FMRs from the Buffalo Metropolitan Service Area. There is a not-for-profit in that community that actually provides housing search services. So there, in that jurisdiction, there are multiple PHAs, but they all work with that agency. So now with small area FMRs, it's even more important. That partnership is more important than ever to help families make good decisions in their housing search. So you may have an opportunity in your community to use the implementation of small area FMRs to establish or improve an existing partnership that helps your families through the housing search. Also, it's really important that you brief your local officials. When you're implementing small area FMRs, obviously landlords may not be happy with what's happening. Parts of the community may not like it. You could experience owners complaining about rents that were previously approvable that cannot be approved now. So it's better to be on the front end and let your local officials know what's coming ahead of time. And you'll know what the best thing is, whether it's a one-on-one meeting with a mayor or a county executive, if it's a letter to local officials. But it's a good idea to let them know. And conversely, and unfortunately, you may experience some NIMBYism, some resistance, opposition to the increased payment standards as it opens up more housing opportunities to persons who have a voucher. So again, that's another reason to brief local officials so they understand what's happening and why. I did want to share with you an example of a mobility program. This is one that's actually funded with Housing Choice Voucher admin fees. The Westchester County in Westchester, New York, the voucher program is part of a statewide voucher program, and they actually do fund mobility counseling services. This is a map of the county. The areas in blue are considered opportunity areas that have higher higher payment standards due to small area FMRs. And for persons moving to those areas, the state does fund counseling services to help families to access these communities. It's a program that it helps families. It's a partnership, families and landlords, but it's really 3 phases: pre-mobility counseling, so helping families be ready to make a move to these opportunity areas, some additional housing search assistance, and then post-move counseling and support, so to help families have a successful relationship with their landlord and have a long-term tenancy. And then this is just an example of a little mailer that was done with that program. So we're going to open it back up to a final round of question and answers that the participants may have after hearing from our 3 partner PHAs. So Jesse?
All right, so Dave, it looks like we have a couple of questions for you. They were asking about what software that Plano uses and that you were discussing.
We use Lindsay software. Just about all the big guys pretty much run the same methodology. Someplace you're going to load a table and point either the tenant or the property back to the table.
And then there was a second question for you regarding if there was a hyperlink to see your SAFMR chart.
Yeah, you can go right to our website, which is planoha.org. And one of the tabs says allowances and payment standards. You'll see it right there.
All right, great. Thanks, Dave. And then, David, we have a couple of questions for you, mainly also about software. The first question is what software BHA is currently using, and you added emphasis light. Was there anything else you wanted to add on to that one about the software?
No, that's it. Emphasis Elite is what we currently use.
Okay. And then the next question was about the tool that you had showed, mainly the payment standard with it built in the affordability tool. They were asking if they could get access to that, but I think you were saying that you developed it. So maybe can we get some information on how that was developed and the steps you went to develop that for your PHA?
Yeah, actually, so we worked with a software provider. It's actually CVR Associates helped us develop that tool, and so we kind of came up with the concept and worked with the CVR to develop the tool. I think the tool existed already on some other websites, but we kind of continued to build it out so that it could look at rent reasonableness, and so there's, and it's, ultimately it just takes into consideration the calculations that are in a 50058, but also builds in the rent reasonableness portion as well. The thing you can do is you can just go look at it on our website to see how it works. And put in a bunch of different variables. It's bostonhousing.org/rent. If you see what you like, you can reach out to me, david.gleish@bostonhousing.org, and I can kind of direct you, can answer any questions for you on the specifics of the tool or how to go about potentially developing it.
Okay, thanks, David. So we have one that David did address in the chat, but I'll read it here just in case we want to add more information. It says, if we put a hold harmless policy in place year 1, when the SAFMRs are published each year and the SAFMR exceeds the payment standard that has been in place due to the hold harmless policy, let's say this happens in year 3, would we then apply the new higher SAFMR payment standard for the annual re-exam in year 3?
And that's an excellent question that I'll be glad to take. And the answer is yes. So the hold harmless policy is only needed for protections when the payment standard's going down. So once, and this is pretty common that it happens, that you may initially see a dip, but over time, payment standards and FMRs do trend upwards. So once you've reached a payment standard that is higher than the amount for the hold harmless, you would use the higher payment standard.
You can think of the hold harmless policy as on the individual family level. So it's the payment standard that the individual family had, but the entire PHA's payment standard schedule is based on the small area FMRs. So you're not toggling between a small area FMR payment standard schedule and a Metro FMR payment standard schedule, you have your smaller FMR payment standard schedule. But for families where the decrease in the payment standard applied to them, you're using that family's payment standard at the time of the decrease. So there's been a couple of questions in the chat about whether you're using the Metro FMR, but no, after October 1 of next year, all mandatory PHAs are using the published small area FMR. It's just that families, if you're using the hold harmless policy and families had a payment standard that is lower, you just stick with that payment standard the family had until such time that the new small area FMR exceeds that old payment standard. While I'm off mute, I also saw another question related to, can you do exception payment standards just for certain properties rather than the entire zip code? And the answer to that is no. A payment standard has to be based on either the zip code or the FMR area, or if you wanted to go lower than the zip code, you could establish census tract based payment standards, but you cannot set payment standards for specific properties. It has to be for a geography. If you have a jurisdiction where the zip code, one end of the zip code has really high rent properties and the other end of the zip code has really low rent properties, and you find that maybe you want to do a census tract based payment standard so that you can use a smaller geography to better target the rents, you could try that, which might get to some of your goal here where you're able to reach the higher rent complexes. But you also could just request an exception payment standard for that zip code, but you can't get an exception payment standard just for a specific property.
Great. And before we get back to the questions that were submitted, we have an individual with their hand raised. And now you have the floor.
Good afternoon. I was just wondering, we have a county with 3 housing authorities with an agreement that all of our Section 8 applicants can pretty much go everywhere. So what do we do with our payment standard now? And how is that going to be accomplished? Thank you.
Let me start with the question. Do the 3 PHAs agree to use the same payment standard now? I know that is a common concern when there's overlapping restrictions.
I'm asking, do we have to agree to do the same? Because pretty much our Section 8 participants go anywhere in the county, regardless of the city. I mean, and then they can use their voucher without porting in and out of any particular housing authority.
Well, no, there is each public housing authority has the authority to set its payment standards as it sees fit within the 90 to 110% range. And that has, whether they're overlapping jurisdictions that are using the regular FMR or in a mandatory small area FMR. So there's no requirement that housing authorities sync up their policies. However, if you're able to do so, it's a best practice, because you're right that it's going to cause a lot of confusion if different housing authorities are approving different rent levels in the same zip code.
That answered my question. Thank you so very much.
It looks like we received another question about hold harmless. If we are doing a hold harmless policy, but a household's voucher size needs to decrease due to household composition change, do we use the old MSA payment standard, or do we have to switch to the SAFMR at the same time?
The hold harmless only applies if the family's household composition does not change and if the family's does not move. So if at any point in time something happens so that the household should be using a different payment standard, so they use they're now eligible for a different bedroom size, you are going to use your payment standard table that's based upon the small area FMRs. Hold harmless only protects the family at the old payment standard if their circumstances have not changed.
Frequently asked questions that we currently have published, they get to some of these specific hold harmless questions that we've answered verbally today, including this one. So I'm going to throw that in the chat again, just in case you want the in writing reference for what we're saying verbally today. So look for that here in the chat in just a second. So it's our frequently asked questions that we previously published.
So here we have an attendee who's stating that they thought previously that when they were looking at a 2024 small area FMR, that it had one amount rather than all zip codes. Are there different charts that have them with one amount rather than by zip code, or is it always by zip code in that regard?
The HUD user data sets have a lookup by zip code, but they also have a lookup by metropolitan service area. So I can't speak to what the participant personally experienced, but there is the ability to look up both the area-wide FMRs and the small area FMRs, and they are different links.
All right. And then here's a question about grouping zip codes. So if we are able to do the groupings, is there a chance that the groupings could change each year?
And the answer would be yes. The Housing Authority each year, as you analyze your payment standards and any changes in the small area FMRs, you could make a decision to change your groupings around to be more logical, to reflect your market, for ease of administration. The most important thing is just make sure that your administrative plan reflects the policy you're going to use to establish the groups, and if your policy changes, that you update it.
All right, and this question might be for one of the PHAs. The question is about when moving to SAFMRs, the impact that it had on landlords, if there was a significant decrease in landlord participation, if there was it temporary, or did it mainly stay the same?
In Plano, ours stayed the same. It had no effect at all because the landlords that are going to participate in the program are going to participate. At least that was our experience.
Same with Allegheny.
If anything, I would say, I don't think we have great data on this, but the landlords certainly have increased just because we have voucher holders in different neighborhoods that we didn't have before. So definitely an increase in the number of landlords that participate.
And then we have another question here. It says, are we able to blend all of our zip codes into one grouping as long as that rate is within the basic range, 90 to 110% of each zip code? And then they added the comment that they only have a few zip codes that are all very similar with rates.
So the answer is yes. So whether it's one group or multiple groups, you're allowed to blend and have a single payment standard for multiple zip codes. And yes, and as it was said in the question, as long as that grouping stays within the 90 to 110% range of every small area FMR that's in the grouping.
And then we have another question. It says, I want to verify that we can request an exception payment standard for each zip code, not necessarily in general, but for all zip codes.
So yes, you can request an exception payment standard for just a zip code. So if there is one outlier, you've got 10 zip codes and there's only one outlier where you really feel like you need an exception payment standard, you can request just for that zip code.
You request an exception for all zip codes in a generic request, or would the request have to justify the exception on a zip code by zip code basis?
So under the current notice, your qualifications are fairly simple of how you apply for it. If we get to October of next year and we're talking about the standard program regulations, let's say HUD doesn't issue another notice for some reason, there's some data analysis that has to be run basically at the census tract level. And we are happy to we can work through CVR to provide some technical assistance on how to get those kinds of requests in, or you can email us at smallerfmrs at HUD.gov and we can answer some questions there. So the simplified process through the current notice doesn't require a whole lot of technical data looking at the individual zip codes. If you want to do it for one or for all, it's not really getting into that level of detail, but I guess we will have to see where we are in October to provide more specific guidance, but there is a way to do one zip code, half your zip codes, all your zip codes, just depending on, your local situation and what your local data is showing.
So before we move to the next question, I just will add, it is important because we don't know what the landscape's going to look like for requesting exception payment standards come October 1. I think if PHAs believe they're going to need exception payment standards in certain zip codes or all zip codes, it's important to start collecting the data for that justification just in case you need it. And two key pieces of data being about your search times. So if you're having excessive search times in zip codes, that could justify an exception, or data that indicates that people are going to be rent burdened in particular zip codes.
Now we have another hold harmless question. Using hold harmless, keeping the payment standard in place for that family at the next recertification, provided that the SAFMR is still lower, do you keep last year's payment standard, or will it update to the new Metro FMR, or does it cap at that old FMR that you were using every year until the SAFMR then exceeds that amount?
The hold harmless and the payment standard, it's very specific to that family. So if the payment standards go down in a particular zip code, whatever payment standard was being used for that family, whatever that number is, stays in place. So if the exception payment standard was $1,000 and the payment standard goes down to $900, for that family, then the hold harmless payment standard will be $1,000 until such time as the payment standard based on small area FMRs goes above that number. So it's not based on the small area FMRs, it's not based on the metropolitan FMRs, it's based on the payment standard that was provided to the family at the time that payment standards went down for that zip code.
I'm just going to tag on to that because I can see the kind of continued confusion on the issue. It's like Michael was saying, it's the number that you stick to, and when you come to a subsequent calendar year, you do not update to the most current FMR, even though initially that hold harmless was an FMR. You're just going to stick to that number and don't update it until your current SAFMR or payment standard exceeds the hold harmless one.
Let's see, we have a question here. The question is about, with all of these changes that are occurring, is HUD forecasting a change on the administrative funding calculation based on all of these changes with the SAFMRs?
HUD is providing each PHA an extra $10,000 for its extraordinary costs for implementation, but there is no relationship that I'm aware of between the administrative fee formula and the use of small area FMRs.
Hey, Michael, this is Stephen Durham. That is correct. There is no specific correlation between the two, and you're correct. We did provide an additional $10,000 to the new mandatory adopting PHAs. And just from the HUD perspective, we're always advocating to our friends on the Hill for 100% funding of the admin fee. Unfortunately, we're subject to appropriations, and so we understand that we're asking a lot of PHAs in a limited funding environment at times, but we always do try to make some concessions and backstops available through our implementation notice, through our admin fee set-asides for specific activities that may cause PHAs to incur higher costs. So I highly encourage you guys to familiarize yourselves with that implementation notice when it comes out after we get an appropriation, to see what additional monies are available to your PHAs and if you qualify.
Thanks, Stephen. Next question we have here is, it's a statement first and then a question. So a PHA may continue to use the existing HIAT payment standard for the family subsidy calculation as long as the family continues to receive the voucher assistance in that unit. So they are asking, are you saying that you increase the payment standard if the family composition changes, but the family remains in the unit?
Yes, that's correct. If the family composition changes, which would require a change in payment standard, that you have to use the correct payment schedule. The hold harmless only applies if a family stays in the same unit and their household composition does not change.
Here's a question. It says, I am assuming once a PSA chooses one of the three, hold harmless, gradual, or no change in policy, then that decision stays and cannot be changed in future years. So what they're saying is that if they go and they choose no change, and then they have, based on some of the information they're learning with Hotline Inspire, then they may go with gradual. Can they revise their policy in the future if they chose to do gradual initially?
The choice of policy, it's discretionary and it's part of your administrative plan. So it is at the full discretion of the housing authority which policy to use and to possibly to change. The only thing that's important to note is that it is regulatory, that if a payment standard is being decreased, that a family has to be given 12 months written notice of the change. So for example, if you've decided to go from hold harmless to a phase down policy, you still have to give the family the 1 year notice that you can't implement it immediately. You have to give them one year's notice of the change and how that's going to affect them.
How do you document that the family is under hold harmless and not the current FMR?
Well, it's going to be each housing authority, what system you use, it may be software dependent. So Dave or David, do you have any insight you can share based on your own experiences about how this could be flagged in the software?
It's almost going to be a one-off every single time. So you're probably going to have to document and then be prepared to have that presented to your auditor, because with your luck, this will be the tenant that gets pulled for your annual audit.
Do we have to give 12 months notice if the payment standard change would have no effect on the household?
Well, the requirement is that if the family's payment standard is going to decrease. So if the payment standard you use to calculate the family's housing assistance payment amount is going to decrease, you must give them a 12-month notice of the change.
But there were a handful of PHAs that had very specific scenarios with their local jurisdiction that they sent to me, and I attempted to use the chat and Q&A to reach out. So if you're a PHA with a very specific question, please email us at SAFMRs@HUD, and we are happy to answer your individual question. Jesse, I will just turn it back to you.
Sure. We actually have one other question that's come in, and then we have someone who called in. So, Ralph, I see that you are wanting to ask a question, so I'm going to send you a request to unmute your microphone, and if you can accept the request. All right, you should be able to speak.
Allison had replied to my question in the Q&A. The very eastern end of my jurisdiction falls into one of the new small area FMRs. I only have one zip code that falls into my jurisdiction. So I just want to be sure that I don't have to adopt small area FMRs for all the other zip codes that aren't in the SAFMR notice. I just need to do just that one zip code.
That is correct, as I understand your question. So you only have to do small area FMRs in a designated small area FMR area. So if your jurisdiction only has one zip code in that designated area, that is the only place you're required to do small area FMRs.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we have a couple more questions that have kind of trickled in here as we're wrapping up. It says, so is it an acceptable option to use the FMR for the zip code of our city as our standard for everyone?
Well, that depends. I'm assuming in that question that city has a single zip code. So the answer would be yes, you could use the small area FMR as your payment standard, but you can use any small area FMR, you can use a range from 90% or to 110% of the small area FMR for that particular zip code. If you have multiple zip codes, you do need to make sure whatever payment standard you pick stays within the 90 to 110% range of all of the small area FMRs.
All right, Michael, this looks like this is a question that's come in for our partner PHAs. And so how did you come up with a way to determine how the changes impact your tenants? And then how did you start the change over?
Just like you would with regard to a regular change in FMR. You just have to kind of scale it up, which is where are they at now? Is it decreasing? Because you still have the same HUD rule, which is anytime a payment standard decreases, it doesn't take effect until the second annual. You've still got that to fall back on. So you're just taking what you've always done and just really drilling it down at the zip code level or group level.
The other thing you can think about doing too is, I think what Dave said was exactly correct. I know that we spent a lot of time comparing our existing payment standards and then doing some calculations to plug in what things would be under the new payment standards to see kind of where we projected our app would go once we flick the switch, and tried to do some modeling out a couple of years, although it's very hard to predict what's going to happen with respect to rent increases. But I know we spent some time doing that, and it can be a helpful exercise to go through just to understand where your program is going to go based on those changes.
If your PHA has a cooperative agreement with a neighboring agency and your agency is an SAFMR agency, or now under that, would you use the other agency's FMRs?
Well, that's if your agency is in a small area FMR jurisdiction and the other agency that you have a cooperative agreement with also is in a small area is small area FMR, then for those zip codes, yes, if your current agreement is that you share payment standards, you could continue to use those payment standards under that cooperative agreement. The thing you'll need to be careful of is if it happens to be that the two partner agencies potentially have some zip codes that are outside of a mandatory area, because you need to make sure whatever payment standards you use stay within that 90 to 110% range of the small area FMR.
So we could potentially set one payment standard for multiple zip codes as long as it falls within the 90 to 110% range.
Yes, excellent question. So the answer is yes, you could set one payment standard for multiple zip codes as long as it falls within the 90 to 110% range of all of those zip codes.
That's what we are talking about when we say you can do these grouping methods of finding zip codes that are similar, or that you want to group, so long as it's within that 90 to 110% range. And some of the materials that we have on the HUD Exchange, I'm going to put that chat in here, talk a little bit about grouping, as does that PIH Notice 2018-01. So if you're interested in finding ways to simplify the number of zip codes that you have, and I know some of our PHA presenters talked about their strategies, there's also those materials that we have available now to talk a little bit more about ways you can do that. But really great question, Shannon.
All right, and so Michael, I'm going to toss it back over to you in just a moment, but we'll go ahead and go through some of our closing activities. And again, if we have more questions, then we can address them at this moment. It doesn't look like we have any others. So Michael, I'll toss it to you for a moment, and then we can allow Stephen to provide some final comments.
I don't want to steal Stephen's thunder, but I do really appreciate that everybody took out nearly 4 hours of their day to attend this virtual convening. We do want your feedback, so we encourage you to go to the HUD Exchange and use the feedback link to provide us some information. And then as I turn it over to Stephen, I just wanted to show the HUD acknowledgement of support, because this entire virtual convening was funded under HUD's Community Compass program, which is a program for providing technical assistance and capacity building to housing authorities and other recipients of HUD funding. So thank you, and I'll give the floor to Stephen and Allison.
All right, thank you, Michael. And before I wrap this up here, I just wanted to extend a big thank you to the CVR team for helping us and leading us through today's convening, and to thank all you guys for your participation. Looked at like we topped out over about 450 participants. So it means there's a host of interest in the small area FMRs, but there's also a need for information regarding the smaller FMRs. And so this will be the beginning of what will be a series of opportunities for you and your PHAs to learn more about smaller FMRs and to learn from PHAs like our partners here today and our participants from Plano, Boston, and Allegheny. So thank you, David, and Kim. We appreciate you guys taking time for your presentations and for sharing your experience. I think, you know, at the onset of this, and you know, when you first hear that you're a mandatory PHA, a lot of that sparks some kind of a little bit of fear. You know, it's a fear of the unknown at our PHAs, because it's something that you may not have been considering, something that you feel has been kind of you know, pushed upon you. But I do think that there are a lot of benefits that can be taken from it. I think that it gives your PHAs an opportunity to help families in your jurisdiction access neighborhoods that they may not have previously been able to. Do recognize that it may come at a cost. And so that's why there will be TA throughout the year to help you and your PHAs work through that planning to your tools and how does it impact your budget. There's a lot of opportunities in there to protect your families. Talked a lot about the hold harmless options that are available. And so, you know, those are the things that, you know, we're hoping that you guys are able to take back from the sessions like today, discuss amongst your staffs there at the PHA, discuss with your boards, how do you best want to approach this, because at the end of the day, you know, mandatory is mandatory. We know that it has to be done, but we want to make sure that it's done in the best way to service you and your people. And so we really appreciate you guys hanging in there. It's a long day. Hopefully the next opportunities that we gather won't be as long, but they'll be as informative. So once again, I just want to thank everybody for their participation, for the great questions. Thank you to the HUD team, Allison, Brendan, and those that answered questions. And once again, thank you to Michael and to our wonderful host, Jesse, for getting us through the day. So I'll hand it back over to Jesse if you want to close us out. I don't know if there was any more questions, but if you want to close us out, feel free. And thank you all for joining again.
Thank you, Stephen. And we just have one more question here. It says, how will HUD address some budget constraints since HAP costs will increase? If that isn't something we can address here.
Oh, I mean, I think in HAP costs, you know, as always, you know, this is a budget-based program. HAP costs are picked up in the renewal estimates for the following year. So you report those costs that you're incurring in VMS. The intent and the hope is that they're picked up and that we receive full funding from Congress for the needs of the program, so that we can continue to house the families that are on the program and to continue allowing you guys to draw from your waiting list. We do know that there's a substantial amount of PHA reserves out there, so this could be an opportunity to tap those reserves. And as I mentioned earlier, we do always try to put a provision in our implementation notice as a backstop for PHAs that have unforeseen circumstances or increased per unit costs that exceed the original estimates of the PHA. That's our shortfall opportunity, where we do have funds available for PHAs to come in and to make themselves whole, so that they don't have to run at a deficit for the year. And so, as I mentioned earlier, our job as a program is to always try to advocate for as much funding as possible, so that we can continue to house all the families that we know are in desperate need of the assistance, so that they can secure, safe, affordable housing. So, you know, rest assured that we will continue to push forward on that and try to make things available for you guys in the event that, you know, funding does become tight at the PHA level.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephen. So that will conclude the convening today. We will stay on the line for another couple of minutes here, just in case any other questions come through. And again, we will address it in the FAQ document. This convening is being recorded and will be edited and will be posted to the HUD Exchange in a few weeks. And you'll be able to see the webinar as well as the FAQ and the slides that our panelists went through today.